They said no one challenges an alpha king in lives. They were right, until her. She stood in the middle of a crowd of thousands, looked straight at the most feared man in the known world, and called him a liar. Not a whisper. Not a rumor passed through closed doors and nervous hands, out loud, in public, where everyone could hear. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before executions. But Seraphine Vale didn't flinch, and that was the moment everything changed, for the Empire, for the king, and for the woman who didn't yet understand what she had just started. Stay until the end, because this story is going to crack something open in you. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from, like this if you're already feeling it. Let's go. The border city of Ashmere smelled like smoke and salt pork, and the particular fear that settles into a place when soldiers arrive before dawn. It was not the soldiers' boots that woke Seraphine, it was the horses, 30 of them at least, iron-shod hooves on the old cobblestones of the merchant quarter, the rhythm deliberate and heavy, the kind of pace that doesn't care who it wakes because it doesn't have to. She was already at her window when the torches rounded the corner of Silvergate Road, a river of orange light pouring through the pre-dawn dark, and she counted the wolf banners without meaning to. Black fabric, silver wolf's head, the emblem of the Northern Dominion stitched in thread thick as her thumb. She pulled her shawl tighter and told herself it was the cold. It wasn't the cold. The healing house sat at the end of Saltmarsh Lane, a two-story building of crumbling limestone that had served Ashmere's sick for 60 years through 3 governors, 2 floods, and 1 failed uprising that nobody talked about anymore. Seraphine had lived in the upper room since she was 12, first as the apprentice of old Mira, and then, after Mira's lungs gave out 2 winters past, as the healer herself. The room smelled of dried yarrow and boiled linen and the particular sweetness of wound honey, which she imported from a beekeeper in the Western Hills at considerable personal expense because she had learned that clean wounds healed faster than wounds that didn't hurt yet. That was a lesson Mira had tried to teach her with words. Seraphine had learned it from watching people die of infections that should have been minor. She pulled on her boots without bothering with the laces. By the time she reached the street, the Imperial Column had passed into the central plaza, and half of Ashmere was already awake and watching from doorways and second-floor shutters, doing the kind of collective breath-holding that citizens learn when they live on the Empire's edge. The plaza was wide enough for markets and executions, and Seraphine had attended both. Stone pavers, a fountain that hadn't worked in a decade, the Governor's Hall on the north side, its torches newly lit, suggesting someone had received advance warning and had the sense to be presentable, or the sense to be afraid. She moved through the crowd gathering at the plaza's edge, slipping between bodies with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to reaching patience through tight spaces. The people around her spoke in low voices, the way people speak when they're not sure if speaking is allowed. That's the Northern Column. Imperial Guard, look at the armor. How many do you think? Quiet. Seraphine worked her way to the front because she always worked her way to the front. It was a quality old Mira had called recklessness, and Seraphine had always privately categorized as something closer to professional obligation. You cannot assess a situation from the back of a crowd. The column had stopped. The soldiers arranged themselves in a practiced semicircle at the plaza's center, and the precision of it was almost beautiful in the way that anything done with absolute mastery is beautiful, regardless of what that mastery is in service of. These were not border garrison troops. These were not the kind of men who stood around campfires complaining about their rations. Their armor was black iron with silver accents, and every piece of it fit, which sounds like a small thing until you've seen enough soldiers to understand that armor that fits is armor worn by men who are taken seriously enough to be properly equipped. Their wolves were real, 3 of them, massive pale animals on iron chains held by handlers who looked like they'd been selected specifically for their ability to make other people feel small. Then the man at the center dismounted. Seraphine had heard descriptions of Vaeric Draven. Everyone in the border provinces had heard descriptions of the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, the same way everyone knew the shape of a storm system moving toward their coast. Not from personal experience, but from the accumulated testimony of people who had survived proximity to him, or not survived it. She had heard, tall, dark-haired, cold-eyed, the kind of man who carries his violence so close to the surface that you can feel it before he's done anything. She had heard, The Empire's shield and the Empire's blade, a ruler who had held the northern territories together through sheer dominance when the old coalition was fracturing, who had absorbed 7 border lords into the Dominion in 6 years through a combination of negotiation and the credible threat that negotiation was optional. She had heard all of that. It did not prepare her. He was taller than she'd expected, which was saying something given that she'd expected tall. The black wolf fur cloak sat on his shoulders like it had grown there. His face was angular and weathered in the specific way of men who spend real time outdoors in cold climates. Not the decorative weathering of men who hunt for sport, but the deep-cut lines of someone who has slept on frozen ground and considered it unremarkable. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they caught the torchlight as he turned to survey the plaza, were a gray so dark they registered almost as black. The thing Seraphine noticed, the thing that arrived in her chest like a low bell struck once and then echoing, was not his physical presence, though his physical presence was considerable. It was the quality of stillness around him. The soldiers stood at attention. The crowd pressed backward without anyone telling them to. Even the wolves went quiet, and the lie. That was the other thing. It arrived the way it always did, not as a sound or a vision, but as a texture, a wrongness in the air around a person, the way a wound that's been dressed too long has a particular quality of heat that tells her things before she looks. Seraphine had been born with truth sight. She had never chosen it, and had never found a comfortable way to describe it to people who didn't have it. The simplest explanation was this. Deception had a physical quality she could perceive the same way she perceived temperature or the smell of infection. It was not perfect. It did not tell her what the lie was or why it was being told. It only told her that something presented as true was not. Standing in the plaza of Ashmere, watching Vaeric Draven step forward to address the gathered crowd, and the visibly terrified governor who had materialized at the top of the hall steps, Seraphine felt it. A wrongness in the air around him that pulsed with every word his herald spoke. His Imperial Grace, Vaeric Draven, Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, Lord Protector of the Ravenguard Summit, comes in the pursuit of justice for the massacre at Coldvale Pass, in which 200 Imperial citizens lost their lives to Southern agitators. He requires the full cooperation of Ashmere's administration in identifying those responsible. The governor, a thin man named Aldrich, who had always reminded Seraphine of paper left in the rain, a man whose spine seemed to be a negotiable concept, descended his steps with a gratitude so naked it was embarrassing to observe. "Of course, Your Grace, of course. Ashmere is at your disposal. We are loyal subjects of the Northern Dominion, and we have every desire to assist in— I need your records." Vaeric's voice was low. Not quiet, low. The distinction was the difference between a man who spoke softly because he was uncertain and a man who spoke at the volume he preferred because volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be listened to. Border crossings, trade manifests, anything that moved through Coldvale in the 6 weeks before the massacre. Yes, immediately. We'll have everything prepared. And I need your healer. The sentence landed differently than the ones before it. Seraphine felt the crowd shift. She felt her own stillness change quality. Our healer? Governor Aldrich looked as though he'd been handed something he didn't know how to hold. "We have a healer, yes, Seraphine Vale. I'm not sure what you'd need. I have wounded men. Your healer will see to them." It was not phrased as a request. It was also not particularly phrased as a command. It was phrased the way you phrase something when the distinction between request and command has ceased to feel relevant to you. Unless Ashmere's administration has some objection to the Alpha King's soldiers receiving medical care. "No, no objection, none at all. I'll send for her immediately." "No need." Vaeric's dark gaze moved through the crowd with the unhurried assessment of a man who was accustomed to finding what he was looking for. It stopped on Seraphine. "She's already here." The crowd between them seemed to redistribute itself without anyone consciously stepping aside. Seraphine found herself in a clear line of sight to a man who had just crossed half a continent to hunt someone responsible for a massacre, and who was looking at her with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a piece of information they already possessed. Which was, she would note later, the first indication that things were already considerably more complicated than they appeared. She met his gaze. She did not step back. The lie in the air around him pulsed again, steady as a second heartbeat. The wounded soldiers were housed in the garrison yard attached to the governor's hall, a space that smelled of old hay and horse, which Seraphine found marginally preferable to the hall itself, which smelled of anxiety and expensive candles burning too many at once. There were 9 men, 3 with genuine injuries, sword cuts, 1 badly, a man with a dislocated shoulder, a soldier who had taken an arrow in the meat of his thigh and had the look of someone who had not slept since it happened. The remaining 6 had minor wounds or nothing at all. She understood the calculation. You bring enough actually wounded men to make the request legitimate, and you use the rest to have someone present who you want present. She treated them in order of severity and said nothing about this. The man with the thigh wound was named Brack, and he had the quality of someone who had decided that if he was going to be in pain, he was going to be angry about it, which Seraphine generally respected as a coping strategy, even when it made her work more difficult. He hissed when she cleaned the wound and swore comprehensively in 3 dialects she recognized, and possibly a 4th she didn't. "This is going to hurt," she told him. "It already hurts." "More than this." "How much more?" "Enough that you'll want to be angry at me, which is fine, but don't grab my hands." He grabbed her hands when she pressed the wound closed to assess the depth, and she let him hold on until the worst of it passed, and then extracted her fingers from his grip with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times. "Didn't grab your hands," he said, clearly lying. "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She was wrapping the shoulder wound, the dislocated joint reset, the soldier gray-faced and determinedly silent in the way of men who believe showing pain in front of their comrades is a form of failure, a belief Seraphine found both comprehensible and medically inconvenient, when she became aware that she was being watched. Not by the soldiers, by the man who had been standing in the yard shadow for some time, who had the particular quality of presence that made his being unnoticed seem like an active choice rather than an accident. She did not turn around. "You could have just asked to speak with me," she said. "Instead of this." A pause. Then the sound of boots on packed dirt, and Vaeric Draven was beside her, not looming exactly. He was too controlled for looming, but occupying space in the specific way of men whose physical presence is a form of argument. She registered his proximity as heat and the faint smell of cold iron and pine resin, the smell of someone who has been outdoors for a long time. "How long did you know I was there?" he asked. "Since you walked in." "You didn't look." "I didn't need to." She tied off the bandage, pressed the soldier's arm back against his side, and finally turned to look at Vaeric directly. Up close, the lines in his face were deeper than she'd assessed from across the plaza. There was old scarring at his jaw, faded to silver, the kind that came from something with an edge. His eyes, at this proximity, were not as unreadable as she'd first thought. They were very deliberately controlled, which was different. "What do you actually want?" "Your Grace." Not a question. He noticed that. "I told you what I want. Your expertise. I have men who need—" "Your men are fine. 3 of them needed actual treatment. The others needed an excuse to have me here." She watched his face, which did not change perceptibly, which was itself a kind of information. "You came to Ashmere because the massacre at Coldvale is being used as justification for something. I heard your herald. Every word of it was technically accurate, and none of it was the truth. The silence that followed had weight, not the stunned silence of the plaza. That had been the silence of a crowd that didn't know what it was witnessing. This was the silence of a man recalibrating. "That's a dangerous thing to say to me," Vaeric said. "I'm aware." "Most people aren't. Most people aren't looking at you." She held his gaze and felt the lie in the air between them pulse once, irregular, almost like it flinched, which was new. In Seraphine's experience, the deceptions she perceived did not respond to her awareness of them. She filed this away. "The massacre happened. People died. You're not lying about that. But you didn't come to Ashmere for justice. You came here for something else, and you're using justice as the presentable face of it." Vaeric was quiet for 3 full seconds. She counted them. Then, very quietly, "You should be careful about what you think you know." "I know what I perceive," she said. "I'm careful about how I use it, usually." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the assessment from across the plaza, which had been efficient and impersonal, but something slower, something that appeared to be trying to solve a problem. "What are you?" he asked, and the question came out more direct than she suspected he'd intended, which told her something about how unsettled he actually was beneath the controlled surface. "A healer," she said. "That's all I am. That's all you need me to be." She picked up her kit and walked back toward the garrison entrance, and she was aware, the awareness was very precise and specific, that he watched her all the way to the door. Governor Aldrich found her before she reached Saltmarsh Lane. He was sweating despite the morning cold, and his eyes had the quality of a man who has been awake long enough to stop managing his expressions carefully. He caught her arm at the garrison gate, and she let him because she could see clearly that he was frightened. And frightened people needed to feel like their urgency was being acknowledged before they could communicate anything useful. Seraphine, I need you to understand the position this puts Ashmere in. Whatever you said to the king in that yard, I didn't say anything inappropriate. You spoke to him like he was an ordinary person." "He is an ordinary person," she said, "with extraordinary power. The distinction matters." Aldrich made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "It matters very much to the ordinary people he has ordinary power over. Listen to me. These men are not here for justice. They're not here for records or manifests. 3 of his generals have been in my hall since an hour before dawn, and they want access to the southern trade routes, and they want cooperation from the border lords, and they are not asking politely." Seraphine looked at him steadily. "What do they want the routes for? The troop movement, what do you think? They're pushing south. Something is coming. Something bigger than what happened at Coldvale, and they're using Coldvale as the justification to station forces in positions they've wanted for a decade." He lowered his voice to something barely above breath. "If you've somehow made the Alpha King notice you, you need to stop being noticeable. Immediately. Pack nothing if you have to. Just, I'm not leaving Ashmere," she said. "I have patience. I have Seraphine." His voice broke on her name in a way that made her stop arguing. "These men kill people who inconvenience them. Do you understand that? Not cruelly, not for pleasure. It's not personal. It's operational. You become an obstacle and you stop being a consideration they have to manage, and you become a problem they've already solved." His eyes were wet. She had known Aldrich for 6 years and had never seen him cry, and was not certain he was fully aware that he was doing it now. "You called him a liar in your head, didn't you? Whatever you have, whatever it is you do, you looked at the Alpha King and you knew he wasn't telling the truth. I've watched you do this for 6 years. I've pretended not to notice because it's never mattered before. This is the first time it is going to get you killed." Seraphine looked at the governor of Ashmere, this thin, frightened man who had managed to keep a border province mostly functional for 20 years by being the kind of administrator who knew how to bend without breaking, who had protected his people through competent negotiation and the strategic deployment of his own insignificance. And she felt something that was not quite pity and not quite grief. It was the feeling of recognizing someone doing the best they know how to do and understanding that the best they know how to do is not going to be enough. "I appreciate the warning," she said. "I mean that. Seraphine." "I'll be careful," she said, and she walked home. She was not careful. This is not to say she was reckless. Recklessness implies a failure to perceive risk. Seraphine perceived the risk with considerable clarity. What she lacked was the ability to treat her perception of deception as something she could simply set aside because the person doing the deceiving was dangerous. It was not a choice she made. It was the same absence of choice that made it impossible for her to dress a wound badly on purpose. Some things are simply not structurally available to a person once the capacity for them has been overwritten by something else. The gathering in the Central Plaza happened at midday. The Alpha King of the Northern Dominion was, apparently, going to address the people of Ashmere directly. This was presented as a courtesy, which was a remarkable amount of optimism from the herald who announced it, given that the soldiers positioned at every plaza entrance made the optional nature of attendance somewhat theoretical. Ashmere's population, approximately 4,000 souls, many of whom had significant opinions about their continued residence in their homes and the ongoing beating of their hearts, gathered in the plaza with an enthusiasm that was entirely manufactured and entirely legible as such. Vaeric stood on the governor's hall steps. He was not wearing the wolf fur cloak now. He was in armor, black iron, well-fitted, the silver wolf's head at his chest, and this had the effect of clarifying something about him that the cloak had made aesthetically complex. He was a soldier who ruled, not a ruler who occasionally encountered soldiers. The armor was not decorative. It showed use. This was a man who did not send his armies out and wait to see what they brought back. He went with them. He was also, Seraphine noted from her position in the crowd, she had, again, worked her way to the front, a habit she was becoming mildly concerned about, extraordinarily tired. The exhaustion didn't show on his face, which he was managing carefully, but it was in the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of stillness that comes not from calm, but from using a great deal of energy to maintain the appearance of calm. He had not slept. She would bet on it. He might not have slept in several days. She thought about what Aldrich had told her. Something bigger coming. Cold Vale as justification. A man who had been in motion for long enough that the motion was the only thing holding him together. He began to speak. The address was well constructed. She would grant him that. It was honest in all the places where honesty served him and carefully architected around the places where it didn't. He spoke about justice for the Cold Vale dead. He spoke about the Northern Dominion's commitment to border security. He spoke about cooperation between Ashmere and the Crown as a matter of mutual benefit. Every word was chosen, every pause calibrated, every shift of his gaze across the crowd deliberate. This was a man who had given many speeches and understood exactly what a speech was for and what it wasn't for. Seraphine felt the lie in the air around him expand and contract with each careful sentence. She was not going to say anything. She had decided this, walking home from the garrison, with the full understanding that saying anything was an act of considerable personal danger. She was going to stand in the crowd. She was going to listen. She was going to observe. She was going to go home, make a tisane, treat whatever injuries or ailments came through her door in the next several days, and wait until the Imperial column left Ashmere the way every storm eventually left Ashmere. With damage she'd have to help fix, but gone. That was the plan. The massacre at Cold Vale Pass, Vaeric said, his voice carrying easily across the plaza's silence, was an act of deliberate provocation by elements opposed to the peace the Northern Dominion has maintained for 14 years. Elements who do not want stability, who profit from chaos, who would see the border provinces destabilized and the empire fractured, not for ideology, not for justice, but for the accumulation of power by a small group of men willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve it. The crowd was quiet. Some of them were nodding, the instinctive agreement of people who have been told something that sounds like what they already believe and have not had the opportunity to assess whether it is also true. "We are here," Vaeric continued, "in Ashmere, because the architects of Cold Vale are operating in these southern territories. They are using your province as a staging ground for the next attack, the next massacre. And the Northern Dominion will not allow that to continue." Every single word was technically true. She could feel it. No deception in the individual components. The architecture, though. The shape of what was being built from those true components. "What you're not saying," Seraphine said, loudly enough to carry, "is who you actually believe is responsible." The plaza went very still. The words had come out of her with the inevitability of something that had been building pressure for too long in a sealed space. She had not planned them. She had planned to be quiet. This is the problem with a capacity for perceiving deception that is not fully under conscious control. It generates reactions that outpace deliberate decision-making, and by the time the deliberate decision-making catches up, the words are already in the air. 4,000 people turned toward her in a wave of collective motion that would have been impressive if she had any attention left over from the fact that Vaeric Draven had also turned toward her, and his expression had done something complicated and fast that resolved, by the time she could fully read it, into something very controlled and very cold. "You're naming Southern Lords as agitators," she said, because she had started and stopping now seemed like the worst possible choice. "You're framing this as an investigation into the Cold Vale massacre, but the position you're taking, the troops you're moving into border staging grounds, that's not an investigation. That's preparation. And the reason you're not saying who you believe is responsible is because naming them publicly before you've moved your forces into position would give them time to respond." She looked at him directly, across the open stones of the plaza, with the awareness pressing at the back of her skull that every soldier in the vicinity had a hand near a weapon. "You know who did this. You came here to set the board before you announced checkmate, and you're using Ashmir's people as currency. You haven't told them they're being spent. The silence that followed was the kind that exists in the absence of breath. No one in the plaza was breathing. Not the governor, visible at the top of the hall steps with an expression of pure and absolute horror. Not the soldiers, whose hands had in fact moved to their weapons. Not the 4,000 citizens of Ashmir who had attended this mandatory voluntary gathering and were now watching a local healer commit what was, under several interpretations of imperial law, an act of public treason. Vaeric looked at her across the distance of the plaza, and the lie in the air around him contracted, drew back, almost like something retreating. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, not a command. Something else. Something that arrived in his voice from somewhere not entirely controlled. "Seraphine Vale," she said. "Healer, Saltmarsh Lane." The silence stretched. Then Vaeric Draven turned to his herald, and the herald's face went through several rapid changes of color, and then Vaeric turned back to her and said, quietly enough that she had to be certain she was reading him correctly, in a voice that did not sound like a man about to order her death. "Bring her." "What?" They did not bring her in chains. She would catalog this as important later. 2 soldiers flanked her across the plaza, while 4,000 people watched without making a sound, and they were close enough to prevent her running but not touching her, which was a distinction that carried information about what was intended, though she could not yet be certain what. The governor's hall smelled of tallow and old wood, and the nervous sweat of administrators who had been awake since before dawn, managing something they had not consented to manage. They moved her through the outer hall and the corridor beyond, and into a room that had been converted for the Alpha King's use. A working space, maps spread across the table, a campaign chest open in the corner, the utilitarian arrangement of a man who does not need comfort from his surroundings because he does not notice surroundings. The soldiers stopped at the door. She went through it alone. Vaeric was at the table, his back to her, looking at the maps. He had removed one gauntlet and set it on the edge of the table and was running his bare hand along a route she could not read from the door. He was doing something with his breathing, controlling it, she thought, slowing it deliberately. The posture of a man who is very angry and is managing that anger as a professional obligation. She waited. "You know what the prescribed response is," he said, still not turning around, "to what you did out there." "Execution," she said, "or a severe public punishment designed to function as a deterrent, depending on the interpretation of the relevant imperial statutes." He turned around. His face had settled back into the controlled expression, but something was different about it now. The control was visible, which meant it was less effective than it had been, which meant he was operating at a higher level of internal disruption than his surface was reflecting. "You're not afraid." "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm also accurate. Those aren't mutually exclusive. What you accused me of in front of 4,000 people was true, was dangerous." His voice was still low, still controlled, but there was an edge under it now that had not been there in the plaza. "Do you understand what a statement like that does to the position I'm trying to hold? The balance I'm trying to maintain between—" He stopped, his jaw tightened. "I'm not explaining myself to a border healer." "You just started to," Seraphine said. Another silence. This one was different from the others. She watched him watch her, and the lie in the air around him had changed. Not pulsing now, present, but quieter, like something that had been caught mid-motion and stopped, uncertain of its next step. "I know who killed the people at Coldvale," Vaeric said finally, and his voice was very precise now, each word placed deliberately. "Lord Malrec Thorn, a southern noble with military resources, political reach, and the patience to plan an atrocity that would give him justification to rally the border lords against the Northern Dominion. He is preparing for an assault on Ravengard itself, and if I announce what I know before I've positioned my forces appropriately, he will move first, and he will win, and the war that follows will kill not hundreds, but tens of thousands." He looked at her steadily. "That's what I'm not saying, Seraphine Vale. That's the shape of the silence you called deception." She absorbed this. "And Ashmir is strategically located, yes, and its people are being protected by information they don't have, are being used without their knowledge for strategic purposes that benefit the Northern Dominion," she said, "which is not the same thing as being protected." He didn't answer. The silence around him was not the silence of a man who has run out of things to say. It was the silence of a man who knows the thing that is true and is disinclined to say it to the person who is already looking at him as if she can see it without being told. "Why didn't you order my execution?" she asked. The question was blunt, and she had intended it to be blunt, because she had noticed that bluntness worked on him in a way that approached honesty works on people accustomed to performance. It disrupted something, created a gap through which something more real than the managed surface could briefly move. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you were right." 3 words. She had not expected 3 words. She had expected justification, deflection, the reframing of public image concerns as mercy. She had not expected the king who had silenced armies with his name to look at a border healer in a converted working room in a provincial hall and say, without apparent difficulty, that she had been right. The truth site registered this as clean, no deception. The first sentence from him with no deception at all. "What happens now?" she said, and it came out quieter than she'd intended. "You come with me," he said, "to Ravengard." The words dropped into the silence of the room with the weight of something that had been decided before he said them. "That's not a request," Seraphine said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. I have patients here. People who depend on... The Northern Dominion will send a replacement, a healer from the capital garrison." He held her gaze. "Under the ancient laws of the Imperial Compact, an Alpha ruler may claim into his service any citizen of the Dominion whose gifts serve the Crown's needs. The law has not been invoked in over a century, but it has not been revoked." He paused. "You called me a liar in front of 4,000 people. I am invoking that law. You belong to the Crown's service until I release you." Seraphine felt something cold move through her, not quite fear. Fear she knew. Fear had a particular quality, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a door closing, of a life's parameters shifting under her feet without her permission. "You're doing this because I embarrassed you," she said. "I'm doing this," Vaeric said, and something moved across his face that she could not fully name. "Because I have never in my life had a person in front of me who I was certain could not lie to me, and I need that, more than I can explain to you right now." The truth site pulsed, clean, every word. She looked at the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, this exhausted, controlled, frightening man who had just told her something that she was nearly certain he had not planned to tell her, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes when a situation assembles itself all at once from its component pieces, that whatever was about to happen, it was not going to be what either of them expected. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Dawn," he said. "Bring your kit. Everything else will be provided." He turned back to his maps. She was dismissed. She walked to the door, and she had her hand on the frame, and she said, without turning around, not entirely understanding why, "Your Grace." "What?" "You should sleep. Whatever is coming, you'll need to think clearly for it. And you haven't slept in," she assessed, "at least 2 days." A long pause. "3, he said. 3, she repeated. "Sleep, Your Grace." She walked out into the corridor, where the soldiers flanked her again, and they escorted her back through the hall and out into the afternoon light of Ashmere's central plaza, where 4,000 people had dispersed, and the square was empty, and the wolf banners hung still in the windless cold. She had 6 hours to say goodbye to a life she had built one patient at a time, in a limestone building on a lane that smelled of yarrow and wound honey and the accumulated history of other people's pain. She used 5 of them on a list of instructions for whoever the Crown sent to replace her. The 6th hour, she sat by the window where she had watched the torches come around the corner before dawn, and she watched the dark. And she did not think about what came next, because some things are easier to walk into if you have not spent too much time imagining them. At dawn, she was in the garrison yard with her kit and 2 additional bags she had packed in the middle of the night. He was already there. He had slept. She could see it in the change in his face, the very slight and very careful adjustment in how he held himself. He looked at her bags, and something moved through his expression that was not quite surprise. "You said bring your kit," she said. "You didn't specify what that meant." "I didn't," he agreed. She loaded her bags herself, because she had learned that waiting for people to do things for her led to things being done badly, and she was already turning toward the horse she had been assigned, a gray gelding, calm-eyed, clearly selected by someone who had made a thoughtful assessment of the kind of animal that would suit a healer on a long mountain road. When Vaeric said, not loudly, directed at the back of her head, "Seraphine," she turned. "What you said in the plaza." He held her gaze. "I'm going to need you to understand something. What you can do, whatever it is you can do, it stays between us. You tell no one what you perceived. You tell no one why I brought you. As far as this column and the court at Ravengard are concerned, you're a healer I claimed under the compact because I required a civilian medic, and you were available. That's the story. You want me to lie for you," she said. "I want you to withhold information for strategic reasons," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about this. "Not really," she said. He stared at her. "I'll withhold the information," she said. "But not because it's different from lying. Because I've decided the strategic reasons are good enough this time." She held his gaze steadily. "Don't expect that to be a permanent arrangement." The column assembled around them. 30 soldiers, 3 wolves, the handlers, the supply wagons with the governor's records packed in sealed cases. The morning was cold and gray and tasted of approaching weather. Vaeric Draven looked at the healer from Ashmere for one long moment that she would not fully understand until much later, and then he turned and mounted his horse, and the column began to move. She rode toward the back, watching the city she had lived in for most of her life diminish behind her. The limestone buildings and the broken fountain and the smoke from early morning fires that meant people were making breakfast and beginning days that would proceed without her. She had the sensation of having stepped off the edge of something. She was 3 hours into the mountain road, the trees closing high above them and the cold deepening in the shadows between the rocks, when the sound reached her from the rear of the column, a rider, hard and fast, coming from behind, and she turned to see one of the garrison soldiers pulling up alongside Vaeric with a dispatched message. And she watched Vaeric read it, and she watched the color change in his face with the precise efficiency of something being extinguished. He turned to his second in command, a broad-shouldered man named General Sorvath, who had the manner of someone who had been difficult to surprise for approximately 30 years, and said something in a voice too low to carry. Sorvath's face did something similar. Then Vaeric turned his horse and rode back down the column to her, and pulled up beside her gray gelding, and looked at her with an expression she had not yet seen on him. Not controlled, not managing. Something underneath the management, moving to the surface because whatever was in that dispatch was significant enough to push through. "The southern border lords have already moved," he said. "Thorn didn't wait. He has forces positioned at 3 crossing points, and he sent terms to Ravengard." He paused. The air between them was very still. "The terms include a demand for my abdication and the dissolution of the Northern Dominion, and the guarantee that if I refuse—" His voice did not change in volume, but something in its texture did, something that made the gray gelding shift under her despite having done nothing startling. "He will begin executing border province citizens as demonstration of his capability. He has named Ashmere specifically. He has named this column as his intended first target, because it is exposed, because it is a day from any reinforcement, and because destroying the Alpha King on an open mountain road sends a clearer message than anything he could do at Ravengard's walls." Seraphine looked at him. "We are being hunted," Vaeric said, "on this road, right now, by a man who has had 3 days to position his forces for this specific ambush, and I have 30 soldiers and no reinforcement within—" The first arrow came from the tree line to the east. It missed Vaeric's shoulder by a hand's width and buried itself in the saddle of the horse behind him. The second arrow did not miss. It took General Sorvath through the meat of his left arm, high up near the shoulder, and the sound he made was not a scream. Men like Sorvath do not scream. It is a point of professional pride that borders on pathology, but a short, compressed sound of genuine surprise, which in its own way was more alarming, because Sorvath was not a man who was easily surprised by pain. Then the tree line erupted. Not arrows this time. Men. 30, 40, more emerging from the pine shadows on both sides of the road with the coordinated efficiency of soldiers who have been waiting in position long enough to be cold and angry about it, which is, militarily speaking, one of the more dangerous emotional states to encounter in an opponent. They were not wearing Thorn's colors. They were in civilian rough spun, which told Seraphine two things simultaneously. That Malrek Thorn was experienced enough to understand the difference between an ambush and an act of war that could be attributed, and that whoever had planned this operation had been thinking several steps ahead for quite some time. Vaeric's horse reared. He controlled it with his knees, both hands already moving, one to the sword at his hip, one to the signal horn at his saddle. 3 short blasts that meant something to his soldiers and meant nothing to Seraphine except that he had not panicked, which under the circumstances she found both reassuring and unsettling in equal measure. The reassuring part was obvious. The unsettling part was the recognition that a man who does not panic when 40 soldiers emerge from a tree line has encountered this situation, or something sufficiently like it, enough times that the panic response has simply been worn away. Seraphine! His voice cut through the noise of the column reorganizing itself, soldiers pulling weapons, horses screaming, the handlers fighting to control the wolves who had gone from stillness to explosive tension in the span of a breath. Off the road, left side, the drop behind the boulder, go. The wounded will need, there are no wounded yet, go. She went, yes. This is the pragmatic calculus of survival in a situation you did not choose and cannot immediately alter. You assess what you can control, you do the thing that keeps you functional for the next 5 minutes, and you do not spend those 5 minutes arguing with the person who has more immediate experience of the situation than you do. Seraphine had learned this not from warfare, but from medicine, where it presented as the same principle in a quieter register. You cannot help anyone if you are also dying. She got off the road. The boulder he'd indicated was a granite shelf the size of a small building, jutting from the mountain's flank at the road's edge with a natural hollow behind it, where snowmelt had carved the stone over a very long time. She pressed into it and got her back against the rock and looked out at the road from a position of relative cover. And what she saw was approximately 30 Imperial soldiers fighting approximately 50 ambushers on a mountain road 12 feet wide, which meant that the numerical disadvantage was partially negated by the geography. You cannot effectively deploy 50 men on a 12-foot road, but only partially. Vaeric was already in the middle of it. She had prepared herself intellectually for the possibility that the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion was formidable in a fight. She had not prepared herself for what formidable actually looked like when stripped of the controlled surface and the managed distance and the deliberate performance of power, when what remained was a man doing the thing he was, at the most fundamental structural level, built for. He moved differently than everyone else on that road. Not faster, exactly. Some of his soldiers were faster, but with a quality of absolute certainty about where the next threat was coming from and what to do about it that made everyone around him look like they were making decisions in real time while he was executing a plan he'd formulated before the fighting started. The sword in his right hand was not decorative. It was not used decoratively. Every motion was direct and economical in the way of someone who has long since stopped performing violence and simply does it, which is its own kind of terrifying when you are watching it happen from behind a boulder. But there were too many of them. Seraphine could see it from where she was in a way that was harder to see from inside the fight. The numbers, the way the ambushers were managing the road's geometry, using the tree line to funnel the Imperial soldiers into groups small enough to isolate. 3 of Vaeric's men were already down. Not dead, she thought, not all of them. She could see at least one moving, but down. Sorvath was fighting one-handed, which was either impressive or stupid, and was probably both. The wolves had been released. This was, she thought, the clearest indication yet that this had moved beyond the manageable. The pale animals tore through the ambushers' eastern flank with a violence so efficient it was almost abstract, and the handlers worked with them in a practiced rhythm that spoke to years of training, but there were only 3 wolves and 50-plus men, and the mathematics of the situation did not shift enough to matter. She assessed her kit, medical supplies, a healer's knife for cutting bandages and lancing wounds, 3 vials of wound honey, linen, a small blade she carried for the same reason anyone who is occasionally alone in remote areas carries a small blade. Not because she expected to use it, but because expecting not to need something and not having it available are 2 different failures. She had nothing that would be useful in the next 60 seconds of the situation developing on the road. She had something else. The truth sight was not a weapon. She had never used it as a weapon, had never thought of it as one, had spent her life being careful to think of it as exactly what it was, a perceptive capacity. a way of reading the texture of honesty and deception in the people around her. But she had used it in the crowd in the plaza, and she had used it in the garrison yard, and she had not yet fully examined the fact that it had done something in Vaeric's presence that it did not normally do, that the lie around him had responded to her awareness of it, had shifted, had contracted. She was thinking about this, rapidly, in the analytical corner of her mind that continued functioning even during crisis, which was either a gift or a curse depending on the circumstances. When the ambusher came around the boulder, he was a large man, broad through the chest, with the look of someone who has done physical work for most of his life, and has found in this ambush an extension of the same labor. He had a short sword and a face that did not have cruelty in it, which she noted because cruelty would have been simpler to manage. He had the face of a man doing a job he has been paid to do and intends to do competently. "Come out from there," he said. Seraphine looked at him. "I said come out. You don't want to hurt me," she said. Not a statement of hope, a statement of fact as she perceived it. "You've been paid to secure the column and eliminate the Alpha King's escort. You weren't told to harm a civilian healer." The man hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but it was real. "You were told," she continued, watching him, reading the texture of what moved through the air between them, "that this was a straightforward operation. Show up, overwhelm the column, achieve the objective. Nobody mentioned that the healer had any particular significance. Nobody told you to hurt her specifically, and you're not the kind of man who hurts people he hasn't been specifically told to hurt." The hesitation stretched. "Who gave you the order?" she asked. "That's not—" Was it Thorn directly, or a lieutenant? Something moved through his face. She read it as she read wounds, the texture of what was real underneath what was presented. "Lieutenant, I've never seen Thorn. Most of his people haven't," she said. "That's how he operates. Layers. So that when this goes wrong, none of you can identify him." She held the man's gaze steadily. "And it is going to go wrong. Not because I'm telling you so, because 40 men do not eliminate Vaeric Draven on a mountain road. That's not what today is. Today is a message. And the message is already being sent. Whether you hurt me or not won't change that." The sounds from the road had shifted. She could hear it without looking. The quality of the combat changing, the ambushers' coordination beginning to fragment, which meant the Imperial soldiers were finding the gaps in the geometry that always open up when the initial momentum of an ambush fails to achieve its primary objective. The man with the short sword looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked toward the road. Then he looked back at her. "I'm going to go," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You should." He went. Into the trees, not toward the road. A man who had made a private calculation about the value of his continued presence in a situation that was deteriorating, which was, she thought, one of the more rational decisions she had witnessed in the past several hours. She stayed behind the boulder and did not move until the sounds from the road changed again, settling from combat into the specific quality of aftermath. The noise of people checking each other, the particular silence of a fight that has concluded, the low voices of men assessing what has been lost. Then she stood up and walked back onto the road. 6 of Vaeric's soldiers were down. 2 of them dead. She could tell from the stillness before she reached them, the particular quality of absolute non-motion that she had learned to read when she was 12 years old and had never found a way to unlearn. The other 4 were wounded in varying degrees of severity, and she moved to them with the systematic efficiency of someone who has very little emotional bandwidth available for anything except the immediate work. Sorvath was sitting against the side of a supply wagon with his right hand pressed over the arrow wound, which he had not removed, which was the correct choice. He looked at her when she approached with the expression of a man conserving energy by reducing everything he does not absolutely need to do. "Arrow's still in," she said. "I know it's still in. Don't move it." "I wasn't going to move it." "Some people move it," she said, unpacking her kit beside him with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this enough that it happened without conscious direction. "Some people are idiots," Sorvath said. "Yes." She assessed the wound without touching it yet. The arrow had gone in at an angle, which was either better or worse than straight in depending on what it had hit on the way, and she wouldn't know that until she looked properly. "This is going to take time. We don't have a lot of time." "Then I'll be efficient," she said. "Be quiet." He was quiet. She worked. The truth about emergency medicine in the field, the truth she had learned and relearned and would never stop relearning, was that it was mostly mechanics. Your hands did what they had been trained to do, and your mind stayed in the immediate space of the problem in front of you, and everything that was not the problem. The dead men 10 feet away, the ambushers who had retreated into the tree line, the fact that she was on a mountain road a day from any reinforcement, became information she held in peripheral awareness rather than active attention. It was not dissociation. It was focus, which is a different thing and produces different results. She was splinting the arm of the youngest of the wounded soldiers, a boy who could not have been more than 18, who was trying very hard not to let her see that he was crying, which she pretended not to notice because that was the kindest thing available to her in the circumstances. When Vaeric appeared at her side, he was bleeding from a cut above his left ear that he had not mentioned and apparently did not intend to mention, which told her something about how he categorized the various categories of things worth his attention. "How many can travel?" he asked. "Give me an hour and all 4 of the wounded can travel. One of them is going to need more work when we stop tonight. The other 3 will be uncomfortable but functional." "We don't stop tonight." She looked up at him. The cut above his ear had bled into his hairline and was drying there, and he looked precisely as tired as he had looked before his 3 hours of sleep, with the added quality of someone who has just spent significant physical energy and is running on something below the surface of normal reserve. "How long until they regroup?" 2 hours. "Maybe 3. Thorne's lieutenant will reassess and reposition." He looked down the road, which curved into a switchback around the mountain shoulder 300 meters ahead. "If we move now, we control the geography. If we wait, we don't. You can't move these men in Seraphine." He said her name with a flatness that was not unkind but was absolutely clear about what it meant. "I have 2 dead soldiers and 4 wounded and 50 miles of mountain road between here and the first defensible position. I need your professional assessment, not your preference about what would be ideal." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "The boy with the arm can ride if someone helps him mount. The shoulder wound needs to be immobilized, but the soldier can stay in the saddle under his own power if he doesn't push it. The leg wound—" She glanced at Breck, who she recognized from the garrison yard, who was awake and had the specific expression of a man who has decided that since he is going to be in considerable pain regardless, he is going to be maximally unpleasant about it. "He can ride, but it will reopen the dressing within a mile, and someone needs to be watching him. The arrow wound—" She looked at Sorvath, who was watching her with the expression of a man waiting to hear his sentence. "Can travel in 60 minutes if I work now, and he stays tied to the saddle." "Tied to the saddle," Sorvath repeated. "Yes," she said. "I'm a general." "You're a man with an arrow wound that's going to make you pass out if you try to sit a horse without support," she said. "Being a general doesn't change the physiology." Sorvath looked at Vaeric. Vaeric looked at Seraphine. Then Vaeric said to Sorvath, with a quality of deadpan that she had not previously seen in him and that was surprising enough to recalibrate several of her assumptions, "She said what I said, just with more detail." "You said nothing," Sorvath said. "I thought it very loudly." Sorvath made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Seraphine went back to work. Here is what the histories never adequately render about men like Vaeric Draven. The weight, not the physical weight of armor or command, or the accumulated years of a career defined by violence. The specific gravitational pull of being the person in a group of people who cannot afford to be uncertain, because uncertainty in the person at the center radiates outward and becomes everyone's uncertainty. And a frightened column on an exposed mountain road is a column that makes mistakes. Every leader who has ever led anything in actual conditions, not in theory, not in peacetime exercises, but in the field where the wrong decision gets people killed, understands this at a bone-deep level that cannot be fully communicated to anyone who hasn't carried it. You do not get to be afraid in the way that is visible. You do not get to express the calculation running constantly behind your eyes, the one that is always doing the arithmetic of who you can afford to lose and who you cannot, and what the acceptable cost of the next decision is. You perform certainty. You manufacture it from the available materials, and the available materials are sometimes very thin, and you build with them anyway because the alternative is to watch the people who depend on your certainty discover that it was never structural in the first place. Vaeric organized the column's movement with an efficiency that was, in its own way, a form of care. He redistributed the wounded across saddles, assigned the soldiers in the best condition to flanking positions, reviewed the maps with Sorvath, who was now, somewhat to his visible irritation, secured to his horse with linen strapping, and made decisions about the route with the particular quality of a man who does not have the luxury of the best option and is constructing the least bad one from what is available. He had not mentioned the dead men except once to the lieutenant who handled logistics, and the brevity of the instruction was not indifference. Seraphine had spent enough time around people managing grief to know the difference between indifference and containment. He had put something somewhere and closed a door on it, and the door would open later, at a time of his choosing rather than the situation's choosing. This was its own form of discipline, one that was easy to mistake for coldness from the outside and was not cold at all. It was the opposite of cold. It was the controlled burn of a man who knows what he is carrying and knows that putting it down now is not something the present moment can afford. The column moved. She rode near the middle, which was where she had assessed she would be most useful, close enough to the wounded to monitor them, out of the way of the soldiers managing the road's edges. The gray gelding was steady, which she was grateful for. Her hands were still working the residual mechanics of the past hour, the muscle memory of wound management, and she let them settle as the road curved into the mountain shadow and the afternoon light shifted from direct to diffuse. Vaeric rode to the front and then to the back and then to the front again, which was not restlessness. It was coverage, the assessment of someone who needed to see every part of the thing he was responsible for. She watched him do this without appearing to watch him, the peripheral attention she gave to patients who were not yet willing to tell her what was wrong. He pulled up beside her on his second pass. "How's Sorvath?" he said. "Stable. He'll be angry about the strapping for the next week." "He'll be angry about it for the next year," Vaeric said. "He has opinions about dignity." Most people who've been doing something for a long time have opinions about how it should be done. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "What's the defensible position you mentioned?" "Keld's Pass Outpost, 11 miles northeast. It's a garrison station, technically abandoned, but the walls are intact and there's water." 11 miles. 3 hours at this pace. She did this calculation. 3 hours at this pace, with 4 wounded men, one of whom she was genuinely concerned about regarding the internal structures around that arrow wound, on a mountain road where the second attempt at this ambush was reorganizing somewhere in the tree line behind them. "All right," she said. He looked at her sideways. "That's all? What else would you like me to say?" Most people express objection to being marched through a mountain ambush situation for 11 miles. "Most people don't have a better alternative," she said, and expressing objection to a situation that can't be changed is energy spent on nothing. She paused. 11 miles is manageable. I'll check the wounds when we stop." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The man behind the boulder." She had wondered when he would get to this. "There was a man behind the boulder," she said, not as a question. "My soldiers saw him go into the trees. He didn't come out the other side." He held her gaze with the directional precision she had come to understand as his version of focused attention, not aggressive but utterly committed. "He didn't hurt you?" "No." "Why?" "I talked to him," she said. "You talked to him?" "Yes." "He was an armed ambusher in a live combat situation, and you talked to him." "He wasn't going to hurt me," she said. "Not without a specific instruction to do so and a reason to follow it. I could tell." "You could tell," Vaeric repeated slowly, in the tone of a man who is processing something that doesn't fit the categories he uses to process things with. "Yes." She did not elaborate. She was aware that elaborating, right now, on the road, with the column moving and the light declining and 11 miles of mountain ahead of them, was not the context for a conversation about the nature of truth sight. Some conversations needed stillness and a certain quantity of trust that had not yet been built. He seemed to understand this too, or at least decided not to push it. They rode in silence for a while, and the silence between them was different from the silence in the governor's hall. That silence had been the silence of 2 people negotiating territory. This one was, she searched for the correct description and found something she had not expected. Companionable. Not comfortable exactly. Nothing about this situation was comfortable, but not adversarial either. "I'm sorry," he said. She was so surprised by the sentence that it took her a moment to respond, and he used that moment to continue. "For Ashmere. For using it the way you said. You were right. The people there deserve better than being positioned as strategic currency without their knowledge. She looked at him. The truth site registered it. Clean. You could still inform them, she said. Through Aldrich. Send word that the threat is real and let them make choices about it. I will, he said. When we reach Keld's Pass. I'll send a rider. Thank you, she said. He nodded, once, the way men who are not accustomed to being thanked receive gratitude, a little awkwardly, as if they are not sure what to do with it, but recognize that acknowledging it is the correct response. Keld's Pass outpost was exactly what he had described. Abandoned, walls intact, water from a stone cistern that had been carved into the mountain's flank. It was also cold in the specific way of structures that have not held human heat for long enough that the cold has become structural, embedded in the stone itself, and building a fire in the central room where the garrison's hearth was, did not warm the place so much as create a small zone of non-misery in the middle of a larger zone of misery. Seraphine did not complain about the cold. She was too busy with the arrow wound. She worked by firelight with Vaeric and 2 soldiers holding torches, and Sorvath horizontal on a stone table that was about as comfortable as it sounded, but was at least stable, and the arrow had nicked something on its way in that she needed to be careful about, and the work required a level of precision that was difficult in firelight with cold hands and a patient who was communicating his discomfort through the medium of very controlled silence, which was its own kind of pressure because it meant she couldn't gauge his pain responses accurately. Tell me when it's bad, she said. It's manageable, Sorvath said. That's not what I asked. It's bad, he said through his teeth, when she reached the part where it was bad. I know, she said. Almost done. It took 40 minutes. When she was finished and the wound was clean and closed and dressed and Sorvath was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone doing arithmetic to stay conscious, she allowed herself to sit for the first time since the boulder and become briefly aware of how tired she was. Not dramatically tired. Functionally tired, the kind of tired that accumulates from sustained attention and precise work, that lives in the hands and the back of the neck, and the place between the shoulder blades. That was, Sorvath paused, assessing, acceptable work. High praise, Vaeric said from behind her. Exceptional work, Sorvath revised, without evident difficulty, for someone who just saved my life on a stone table in an abandoned garrison. You are not in danger of dying, Seraphine said. That's almost more insulting than being told you were indifferent, Sorvath said. He sounded, for the first time since the road, almost like himself. She marked this as a good sign. Vaeric set a tin cup of something hot near her elbow. She didn't look to see what it was, but it was hot, which was the relevant characteristic, and went to speak with his lieutenant near the door. She drank what turned out to be a very basic camp broth, the kind made from dried rations reconstituted in water, and it was one of the better things she had tasted in recent memory, which said something about the impact of context on sensory experience. She checked each of the other wounded in turn, adjusted dressings, answered the boy with the splinted arm when he asked, with the determined casualness of someone who had decided that asking this question required an attitude of aggressive normalcy if he was going to be able to use the arm after this. She told him yes, in all likelihood, and she told him this because it was probably true, and because telling him yes was going to affect his recovery in ways that telling him maybe would not, and she had learned that the body's relationship with expectation was real enough to treat as a clinical factor. When she had seen all 4, she went outside. The night at this altitude was extraordinarily clear, the kind of clear that comes from cold air with nothing in it, and the sky above the mountain crests was an indecent quantity of stars. The road stretched back the way they had come and disappeared into the mountain's curve, and somewhere back along it, the reorganized ambush force was making decisions about its next move. She did not hear him approach. She heard him arrive, the sound of boots on stone, and turned. He had removed the armor. The black iron was inside somewhere, propped against the garrison wall, and he was in the dark wool and leather of the underlayer, which made him look, against all expectation, like a person. Not the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, not the architect of a military strategy she was only partially beginning to understand. Just a very tired man standing outside a cold garrison in the middle of a mountain night, looking out at the same stars she was looking at. He was holding something. She looked at it and recognized it as part of her kit, a small sealed tin she used for a particular kind of wound salve. "The cut above your ear," she said. "I know about the cut above my ear. You were going to let it keep bleeding. I've had worse. That's a philosophy of wound care I actively oppose," she said, and took the tin from him. He was very still while she cleaned and dressed the cut, which was the stillness of someone who has learned to be still during this kind of thing, rather than the stillness of someone for whom it is natural. She could feel the tension he was managing in the set of his jaw and the quality of his breath, which was deliberately slowed in the same way she'd observed earlier. "Does it bother you?" he said. "Cleaning wounds? Being touched?" She paused. "No, does it bother you?" "I'm trying to figure that out," he said, which was the most unguarded thing he had said to her, and the truth site registered it as completely clean. She finished the dressing and stepped back. He turned to look at her, and the firelight from inside caught the side of his face, and she saw clearly that he was doing something that she suspected he did not do often, in front of other people. He was not managing the expression. He was simply standing there with whatever was actually in his face, which was exhaustion, and something harder to name, not grief exactly, and not anger, but the specific quality of a person who has been making decisions that cost things for so long that the cost has become a permanent condition rather than a series of acute events. "2 of my men died today," he said. "Yes," she said. "Breck was supposed to go home in 3 months. He has a daughter he's never met." She said nothing. Some things do not benefit from a response, and she had learned to tell the difference. "Vaeric, the one on the left. He'd been with me since the Cavenfall campaign, 12 years. Vaeric looked out at the road. He used to complain about the mountain cold every single campaign. Every time. Same complaint, same timing. I used to think it was annoying." He stopped. "And now it isn't," she said. "No," he said. "Now it isn't." The silence settled. She stood beside him and did not try to fill it or fix it, because those were the wrong impulses for this moment, and she knew it. And after a while, the silence became its own kind of presence, not empty, but full of the things that were being acknowledged without being said. "I need to tell you something," Vaeric said, eventually. "All right. Why I actually came to Ashmere." He turned to look at her fully, and his eyes in the starlight were that dark gray that registered as almost black. Not the official reason. The reason before the official reason. She waited. "I received information 3 weeks ago from a contact inside Thorne's operation. Not reliable information. The contact was second tier, the source was thin. But the information said that there was a person in the border provinces with a perceptive ability that Thorne's people had identified and were planning to acquire. They described the ability as the capacity to detect deception at proximity." He held her gaze. The contact said Thorne wanted this person because she could tell him which of his lieutenants were planning to betray him. A living detection system for the man who was building an empire of lies. Seraphine was very still. "I came to Ashmere," Vaeric said, "before Thorne's people could." She processed this. The processing took several seconds longer than usual because there was a great deal of information in it that required careful arrangement. She had been the reason for the column's destination before she had said a word in the plaza. She had been a strategic objective before she was a publicly inconvenient healer. She had not been found. She had been retrieved. "You were going to take me anyway," she said. "Even if I hadn't spoken in the plaza." "I was going to try to convince you to come voluntarily," he said. "The compact law was the backup." "But you were going to take me." "Yes." Clean. No deception. Just the flat, unadorned honesty of a man who has decided that the cost of the deception is higher than the cost of the truth, which was itself a significant recalibration from where he had started. Seraphine looked at the stars for a moment. Then, "So the choice between coming with you willingly and being taken under the compact was real," he said. "I would not have fabricated it, but the option to simply leave was not. Because Thorne's people were coming. Yes. And you believed that I would be safer with you. I believe you are less likely to be used as a tool for atrocity with me than with Malrec Thorne," he said, with the careful precision of a man who is not inflating his own position beyond what he can honestly claim. "Whether that constitutes safer is a question you're better positioned to answer than I am." She thought about this. She thought about the man behind the boulder and Aldrich's face at the garrison gate. and the way the lie around Vaeric had contracted the first time she looked at him, as if it recognized something. She thought about the two men on the road with their particular stillness of permanent non-motion, and the boy with the arm asking about the future in the only tone he had available to him. "If Thorn had gotten to me first," she said, "if his people had come to Ashmere before yours, would he have given me the option?" "No," Vaeric said, clean. "Then I'm exactly where I chose to be," she said, even if the choice was between a limited set of options. Something moved through his face. Not the controlled adjustment she had been cataloging, something underneath the control, something that had not been there when he was managing the distance. "You're not afraid of me," he said, and this time it was not an observation. It was something closer to a question. "You're not a man I should be afraid of," she said. "Most people would disagree." "Most people are reading the performance," she said, "not the person." The silence that followed was different from any silence that had existed between them. Not the silence of negotiation or the silence of aftermath, or the silence of a man containing what he did not want to show. This silence was, she searched for the word and found it, vulnerable. Not in the sense of weakness, in the sense of a space opened up, walls not down, but a gate briefly unlocked. Then the gate closed. She could see it happen, the managed expression returning, the distance reasserting itself. He was not doing it cruelly. He was doing it because he had been doing it for so long that not doing it was an active effort he could only sustain for a limited time. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll take the first watch. You haven't slept since the 3 hours before dawn. I'm aware." That's not Seraphine, her name again with that particular quality. "I will sleep after the first watch. Right now I need to be awake, and you need not to be." He paused. "You were exceptional today. On the road, with Sorvath, with whatever you said to the man behind the boulder." The words came out with the quality of something that had required more effort to say than their simplicity suggested. "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment. "You're welcome, Your Grace." "Vaeric," he said, quietly, like a door opening an inch. She held his gaze. "Vaeric." He nodded, once, and turned back toward the garrison. She stayed outside for a while longer, in the cold air and the star-dense dark, and she sat with the understanding that had assembled itself in the past several hours and examined it honestly. She was on a mountain road to a city she had never seen, claimed under an ancient law by a man she had known for less than 24 hours, running from an enemy she had not known existed before this morning, carrying a capacity that multiple powerful men had independently assessed as worth controlling. She had exactly what she had always had: her kit, her hands, and the ability to tell the difference between what was real and what was presented, none of which had ever previously needed to be deployed in these particular circumstances. She went inside and found the space that had been arranged for her near the fire and lay down on the thin bedroll and listened to the sounds of the garrison settling into something that was not quite sleep, but was its version of rest. And she thought about what Vaeric had told her, and she thought about the truth sight pulsing against his presence in ways it had never pulsed against anyone before. And she thought about the word he had used, bonded. No, he had not used that word. She had. Somewhere in her mind, reading what she had perceived about them, she had arrived at that word on her own, which was, she thought, probably something she should examine more carefully. She closed her eyes. Outside in the cold, Vaeric Draven stood watch over 11 miles of road they would have to cross tomorrow, and 50-odd men they were not yet safe from, and an empire that was moving toward a war it did not fully understand, and in the garrison at his back, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, there was one person in the world who he was nearly certain could not lie to him. He was not yet fully certain what to do with that. He was certain that losing it was not something he was willing to contemplate, which was, for a man who had built his entire governance on the principle that attachment was a liability, and that what you would not sacrifice had already defeated you, a very significant problem. The night deepened. Somewhere in the tree line to the southwest, a light moved through the trees. Not a torch, too small, too careful. A signal. Someone communicating position to someone else 3 miles out, coordinating in the dark. Thorn's people had not retreated. They had repositioned. And in the morning, when the column tried to move the final 8 miles to Keld's proper, the town, the reinforcements, the safety of actual garrison walls. They were going to find that the road had been closed, not by soldiers, by a rockfall that had been prepared in advance. And in the garrison, on the stone floor by the fire, Seraphine Vale had just entered the first real sleep she'd had in 30 hours, with no knowledge of what was waiting on the road, and no way yet to tell Vaeric what she had begun to suspect about the way her perception of him was changing. The truth sight reading him differently now than it had at the plaza. The wrongness in the air around him no longer pulsing, no longer present at all, as if the lies he had been carrying had begun, in the hours since she met him, to fall away. As if something between them had already begun. The signal light in the tree line moved 3 times and went dark. Vaeric saw it. He stood in the garrison doorway and watched the place where the light had been and did the arithmetic of it without sentimentality, because sentimentality was a luxury that the arithmetic did not permit. 3 pulses. A relay signal, the kind used by coordinated units operating across terrain too large for voice communication, which meant 2 things simultaneously. Thorn's people had not retreated, and they were organized well enough to run night signals through mountain tree cover, which was not a capability you improvised. You built it, you trained it, you maintained it over time. Someone had been planning this for longer than the 3 weeks since his contact's information had surfaced. Someone had been planning this since before he knew Seraphine Vale existed. He went inside and woke his lieutenant. Tup. The rockfall was discovered at first light by the 2 soldiers he sent ahead to assess the road's condition, which was a standard precaution he had taken on mountain roads for 15 years, and which had saved his column's position several times before by finding problems rather than arriving at them. They came back at a run, which told him the news before they spoke it. "Road's closed," the first one said. "Quarter-mile ahead. It's not natural. The stones are too uniform, too positioned." Someone cleared the face above the switchback and brought it down deliberately. How much material? 20 feet of debris. Minimum. Maybe more. Clearance time? With the tools we have? Half a day. Maybe more. Vaeric stood in the garrison yard in the early gray light and felt the shape of what had been done. Not the rockfall itself. That was a tactical inconvenience, not a killing blow. The shape of the thinking behind it. You close the road ahead. You have forces in the tree line behind. You have a column that cannot move forward and cannot move back without walking into prepared positions, and you wait. You do not attack. You wait, and you let the column supplies run down, and you let the mathematics of position do the work for you. Thorn had not sent 50 men to kill the Alpha King on a mountain road. He had sent 50 men to trap him on one. "Get everyone up," Vaeric said. "Full kit. Now." He went back inside to find Seraphine already awake, already moving through the wounded with her kit open, checking dressings with the systematic efficiency he had watched her apply to everything she did. She looked up when he came in and read his face before he said anything, which he had stopped being surprised by and had started simply filing as information. "How bad?" she said. "Roads closed ahead, forces behind us. We're contained." She absorbed this without changing her expression, which he had also stopped being surprised by. "Supplies? 2 days. Maybe 3 if we're careful. The wounded can't travel across terrain, not the arrow wound. Sorvath needs the road." "I know." "Then you need another option." "I know that too," he said, and moved past her to where Sorvath was sitting up against the garrison wall, with the expression of a man who had been awake for some time and had been waiting for this conversation. "I heard," Sorvath said. "I need the messenger birds." Sorvath's jaw tightened. "We sent both birds from the column, before Ashmere, status reports." Vaeric was quiet for 1 second. "Both of them. Standard protocol. You signed the order." "I signed the order for 1 bird. Weekly status." Something moved through Sorvath's face. Not guilt. Sorvath did not do guilt the way other men did. He did something more like precise accountability. The acknowledgement of an error without the emotional scaffolding around it. The second bird went with a detailed route manifest. Departure time, road selection, garrison stops. He met Vaeric's eyes steadily. "I sent it to the coordination office in Keld. Standard logistical copy." The coordination office in Keld, which would have had in its administrative staff any number of people who processed information as part of their daily function. Any number of people who might, for the right price or the right pressure, Have passed a detailed route manifest to someone interested in knowing exactly where the Alpha King's column would be on a mountain road at what time. The silence in the garrison was the silence of a conclusion arriving. Who staffs the coordination office? Vaeric said. It rotates. 4 administrators, 2 clerks, all vetted through the standard. Who vetted them? Sorvath stopped. This is the particular vertigo of betrayal inside an institution. The moment you pull one thread and discover that the thread connects to the system designed to ensure that threads like it don't exist. You vet people through a process. The process is managed by people. The people were vetted through the same process. At some point in the chain, if someone wanted to put a compromised person inside it, all they needed was access to one link. 1. And everything downstream of that link is contaminated in ways you cannot immediately map, because you do not yet know which link it was. Vaeric had built an empire on the principle that loyalty was structural, that you designed systems, created incentives, established consequences severe enough that the cost of betrayal would always exceed its benefit. He had believed, not naively, but empirically, based on 15 years of operational evidence, that this worked, that the architecture held. Thorn had found the gap in the architecture, and he had been patient enough to wait until the gap mattered. Find out, Vaeric said, who specifically sent the manifest from your end. Name. I want it in 10 minutes. He walked out of the garrison into the morning air and stood with his back against the stone wall and did the thing he could not do in front of his soldiers, which was to simply feel, for 60 seconds, the full weight of what the situation actually was. Not the managed version, the real version. 2 dead men on the road, 4 wounded, contained on a mountain with 2 days of supplies, an enemy with a prepared position and the patience of someone who understood that waiting was a weapon. And somewhere inside his own operational chain, a compromise he had not found. 60 seconds. Then he went back inside. The name Sorvath gave him was a clerk named Arvath, 23 years old, 3 years in the coordination office. Unremarkable service record, no flags in his assessment file. From a southern family, not from Thorn's territory, but near enough that it was worth examining. He had processed the manifest, had logged it correctly in the coordination ledger, and had, according to Sorvath's reconstruction of the timestamps, sent a second copy to an address in the lower city of Keld that did not correspond to any official office. Vaeric read the timestamp and the address, and then folded the paper and put it in his coat and went to find Seraphine. She was outside, sitting on a stone shelf above the garrison yard, with her kit closed beside her and her eyes on the road below. She had a small knife out, her healer's knife, the one for cutting bandages, and was cleaning it with a piece of linen in the methodical way of someone who keeps their hands occupied when their mind is working. He sat beside her without asking. She made room without being asked. We have a source, he said, inside the coordination chain. A clerk who copied our route manifest to Thorn's people. She did not look at him. How old? 23. How much do you think he understood about what he was doing? The question landed in a place he had not expected it to land. He had been thinking about the clerk as a vector, a mechanism through which information had moved. He had not been thinking about him as a person making a decision inside a set of circumstances he could not fully see. Does it matter? He said, and it came out less certain than he'd intended. It matters for what happens to him, Seraphine said. It might matter for finding out who else is in the chain. A 23-year-old clerk didn't come up with this on his own. Someone recruited him. Someone identified him as recruitable. Understanding why he said yes tells you where to look for the next one. He was quiet for a moment. You think about things differently than anyone I've worked with. I think about the person, not the problem, she said. The problem is usually the person. He looked at her profile. The steadiness of her attention, the way she held everything she was processing without it showing in her body. The quality of stillness that was not passive but active, something working behind it. He had known her for less than 2 days. He had spent those 2 days in conditions designed to strip away anything that wasn't structural. And what was structural in her was something he was still mapping. There's something else, he said. Yes, she said. There usually is. The second bird Sorvath sent, the route manifest. He looked out at the road. I signed 1 order for 1 bird. Sorvath sent 2. She was quiet. He's been with me for 12 years, Vaeric said. Cavenfall, the Aldrich campaigns, the consolidation of the eastern border. Every significant military action I've taken in over a decade, Sorvath has been in the room. He heard his own voice doing something careful with the words. The way you are careful with something fragile, not because you're certain it will break, but because you cannot afford to find out if it won't. He made a procedural decision to send a second bird with a detailed route manifest. He may have done it in good faith, standard logistical protocol, and the compromise was downstream at the clerk level. Or the compromise is not at the clerk level, Seraphine said. Yes. She turned to look at him then, and he made himself hold her gaze without managing it, because she was going to read him regardless, and managing it was a form of lying to the one person in his immediate vicinity who could tell the difference. You want me to talk to him, she said. I want to know if he's lying to me. She sat with this for a moment. What happens if he is? I don't know yet, Vaeric said, and that's the honest answer. She nodded, slowly, and stood up from the stone shelf and picked up her kit and said, Check his wound first. Give me a reason to be in the room. So she checked Sorvath's wound with the same systematic care she applied to everything, and he sat through it with the same controlled silence of a man who has decided that the indignity of medical dependency is preferable to the alternative. And Vaeric stood near the garrison wall watching the road below the window and saying nothing. Seraphine worked, and she listened, and she felt. Sorvath talked during the wound check the way some patients did. A deflection, filling the silence with something other than the vulnerability of being handled. He talked about the column's supply logistics, about the messenger bird protocol, about the coordination office and its staffing. He was precise and detailed, which was consistent with his nature. He answered questions she asked with the direct efficiency of a man who had been doing operational briefings for most of his professional life. And the truth site told her nothing. Not the absence of deception she had come to register around Vaeric in the hours since the garrison. The clean, opening quality that told her something had changed. Not the pulsing wrongness she had felt in the plaza. Nothing. A flatness in the air around Sorvath that she had not encountered before, and that she spent the duration of the wound check trying to correctly identify. She was packing her kit when it came to her, not lying, not telling the full truth, operating in the space between, where a man with 30 years of operational experience could say everything he intended to say with technical accuracy and leave out the thing he had decided, prior to the conversation, not to include. Sorvath was not deceiving her. He was being silent about something specific, in the particular way of someone who had decided that the something specific was his to hold and not hers to know. The distinction mattered enormously. She said, the second bird, the one with the route manifest. You sent it from your personal kit, not the column supply. Sorvath went very still. The column supply birds are logged in the asset record, she said, not looking at him, closing the clasps on her kit. 2 birds, both logged, both sent. But you mentioned your personal kit this morning when Vaeric asked about the birds. You mentioned it and then moved on. Personal courier birds wouldn't be in the column's asset record. The silence in the garrison had the particular quality of something that had stopped moving. Vaeric turned from the window. Sorvath looked at Seraphine for a long moment, then he looked at Vaeric, and something moved through his face, not guilt, not the collapse of a lie, but something closer to a decision being made. The decision of a man who has been carrying something and has just calculated that the carrying is over. Tell me, Vaeric said. The words came out very quiet. I sent a 3rd bird, Sorvath said, not from the column supply, my own, to a contact in Keld I've maintained for 6 years. He met Vaeric's eyes with a directness that was almost aggressive in its refusal to look away. The contact is not Thorn's. He's mine. He works inside Thorn's southern operation as an asset I've been running independent of the official intelligence chain since the Cavenfall aftermath. He paused. I did not tell you because the intelligence chain in Ravengard has a compromise I have not yet identified, and running this asset through official channels would have exposed him. 6 months ago, he told me there was a plan to acquire a specific individual in the border provinces, someone with a perceptive gift. I began tracking the plan. 3 weeks ago, I had enough to confirm the target was in Ashmere. Vaeric did not move. You knew about Seraphine before I told you. I knew about a target in Ashmere. I didn't know her name until you gave it to me. And you didn't tell me. Because the compromise in the intelligence chain is in the briefing office, Sorvath said. And every conversation between us that goes through official channels goes through the briefing office. I did not know if your private communications were clean. I did not know until I saw how you handled the column departure whether you had received information about this operation from a source I could verify. He held Vaeric's gaze. I made a judgment call. I protected the asset. I protected the operation. And I protected you from information delivered through a channel I could not guarantee was secure. The silence that followed had a texture Seraphine could feel from across the room. This is the particular cruelty of loyalty under pressure. It does not always look like loyalty. A man who has served you faithfully for 12 years, who has made a private calculation that you are better protected by his silence than his disclosure, who has run a parallel operation not to deceive you, but to build you a safety net you didn't know you needed. This man, in the moment of revelation, looks indistinguishable from a man who has been lying to you for 6 months. The evidence is identical. The intent is opposite. And you cannot know which one you are looking at without access to something that is not available in the evidence. You need access to the truth. Vaeric turned to Seraphine. She looked at Sorvath. The flatness in the air around him had not changed. It was not the flatness of concealment. It was the flatness of something that had been completely said. He's telling you everything, she said. Vaeric looked at Sorvath for a long time. Then he said, the contact in Keld, how do we reach him? We can't from here, Sorvath said. He contacts me on a schedule. The next window is 5 days out. We don't have 5 days of supplies. No, Sorvath agreed. We don't. The three of them sat with the shape of the problem. It had a very specific shape. A closed road ahead, a prepared position behind, 5 days to a contact and 2 days of food, and an enemy who was patient enough to have built a rockfall in advance. The compromise in the briefing office, Vaeric said. You have a name? A probability, not a certainty. Give me the probability. Counsel Rethus, Sorvath said. Senior advisory staff. He's been in position for 8 years. His family has land in the Southern Territories. Not Thorn's holdings, but proximate. His financial records, which I accessed through my asset 3 months ago, show irregular deposits beginning approximately 14 months ago, at intervals inconsistent with his official salary. Vaeric said nothing for so long that Seraphine counted the seconds without meaning to. Rethus was a name she did not know. But she watched Vaeric's face, and she watched what the name did to it, and she understood without being told that this was not a name on the periphery of his world. This was someone at the center, someone whose access to information was not incidental but structural, someone who had been in the room. Rethus has been on the Royal Council for 6 years, Vaeric said, finally. Yes, Sorvath said. He was in the room when we planned the Ashmere approach. Yes. He would have had access to every strategic briefing for the past 6 years minimum, Sorvath said. Yes. Vaeric turned away from both of them and stood at the garrison wall with his hands flat against the stone and his head down, and Seraphine watched the thing that moved through his back and his shoulders. Not a physical collapse, nothing that visible, but the internal version of it. The moment when the architecture you built reveals that it has a flaw that has been bearing weight for years. The Empire survived through systems, through chains of trust carefully constructed, through loyalty made structural, through the deliberate engineering of a network of people whose interests aligned sufficiently with the dominions that betrayal remained, in ordinary circumstances, too costly to consider. This was Vaeric's method. This was the thing he had built and maintained and believed in because it had worked, empirically, demonstrably, for 15 years. And Malrek Thorn had understood this about him, had understood that the method itself was the vulnerability. You do not attack a man who has built walls. You get inside the walls. You become part of the structure. And you wait. 8 years. Someone had been patient enough to wait 8 years. He'll have already warned Thorn, Vaeric said, to the wall. When we left Ashmere, he'll have sent word that we were moving, that I had the girl, that the column was exposed. Yes, Sorvath said. He'll send word when we don't arrive at Keld on schedule. Thorn will know the trap is working. Yes, and when Thorn knows the trap is working, he'll move on Ravengard. Vaeric turned back around. His face was the controlled face again. But it was a different quality of control now. Not the management of something that was being concealed, but the management of something that had been looked at directly and was being organized into action. He's been waiting for me to be away from the capital with a significant portion of the guard. He's been waiting for the window. We just gave it to him. The room was very quiet. Seraphine thought about Ravengard, a city she had never seen, a capital she was being brought to. A population that had no idea that the window Thorn had been engineering for years had just opened. She thought about Ashmere and 4,000 people going about their mourning and the thin hope that Vaeric's rider had gotten through with the warning before Thorn's people closed the roads. She thought about what Aldrich had said. These men kill people who inconvenience them, not cruelly, operationally. "What do you need?" she said. Vaeric looked at her. "You've just learned that your intelligence chain is compromised, your position is closed, your capital is exposed, and you have 2 days of supplies," she said. "Those are the conditions. What do you need to work with them?" He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "A way out of this garrison that Thorn's people aren't watching. Is there one?" He pulled a map from the campaign chest and spread it on the stone table. She came to stand beside him and looked at it. Mountain roads, terrain markings, the garrison's position marked in ink. His finger traced a line north of the main road, through terrain marked with the crosshatch symbol she had learned meant rough or impassable. "There's a shepherd's track," he said, "used seasonally. Not on the military maps because it's not viable for a column. It comes out 2 miles above Keld." He looked at her. "It's viable for 2 people." The room was very still. "You need to get to Keld," Seraphine said. "I need to get ahead of Thorn. If I reach Keld and the garrison there is still clean, I can send riders to Ravengard. I can get word to the council before Thorn's forces are in position. I can—" He stopped, started again. "If I stay in this garrison, Thorn wins without fighting, contained, supplies exhausted. He doesn't need to kill me on the road if I starve myself out." "And your men?" she said. "The wounded. Sorvath commands in my absence. The garrison is defensible. 2 days of supplies gives them time if I can get riders back from Keld by tomorrow evening. And if you can't? Then I've made a decision that costs men their lives," he said, with the flat honesty of someone who does not soften this category of statement by calling it something else. "I've made that decision before. It doesn't get easier. You make it anyway." Seraphine looked at the map. The shepherd's track was a line of faint marks, barely a path, through terrain that looked like it was designed specifically to make movement difficult. At altitude, in early cold, with a man who had not slept enough and had a healing cut above his left ear, and had just learned that one of his senior council members had been feeding strategic intelligence to his greatest enemy for 6 years. "I'm coming with you," she said. "This isn't a negotiation." "I know it isn't. I'm coming." She met his eyes. "You need someone who can tell you if the Keld garrison commander is lying when he says his post is clean. You need to know if the rider you're sending to Ravengard is actually going to Ravengard. You need to know, at every step of the next 24 hours, whether the people you're trusting are trustworthy." She held his gaze. "You came to Ashmere to get me before Thorn did. This is why." The garrison was very quiet around them. Vaeric looked at her for a long time. "1 hour," he said. "Pack what you can carry on your back. Leave the rest." He turned to Sorvath. "Hold this position. Ration what we have. Do not engage Thorn's people unless they move on the garrison directly. If I'm not back with riders by tomorrow evening—" "I know what to do," Sorvath said. "I know you do." Vaeric paused. "Rethis, when we reach Keld, I'll send word about the financial records. Don't move on him until I give the order. If we move too early, he warns Thorn before we're in position." "Understood." Vaeric looked at his general. This man of 30 years military experience, one good arm, arrow wound in the other, strapped to a stone table in an abandoned garrison on a mountain road. And something passed between them that Seraphine recognized as the particular communication of people who have operated together long enough that the important things do not require language. "Don't die on this table," Vaeric said. "I've made worse situations into inconveniences," Sorvath said. Vaeric went to prepare. Seraphine stood for a moment in the garrison room in the thin warmth of the fire and looked at the wounded men arranged around it. The boy with the arm, Breck with his thigh wound and his aggressive management of discomfort, the 2 others, and understood that she was about to walk away from people who needed a healer and would not have one, which was a thing that sat badly with her in the specific place where her professional obligations lived. She gave Sorvath every wound instruction she had, written on the back of a supply manifest in the careful, precise hand she used for medical notes. She told him what to watch for, what to do if she was wrong about any of it. He listened with the attention of a man who understood that this information was operational and treated it accordingly. "You'll come back," he said when she was done. "That's the intention," she said. "Good," Sorvath said. "The king needs someone who can't be lied to. He's needed that for considerably longer than he knows." She looked at him. "How long have you known? About what I can do?" "Since the garrison yard in Ashmere, he said. "The way you spoke to him, the way he listened." He paused. "I've served him for 12 years. I have never seen him listen to someone the way he listened to you. In my professional assessment, that is worth more than a shepherd's track and a garrison commander and whatever riders you can get to Ravengard." He held her gaze steadily. "Whatever is between you two, and I'm not a fool about what I'm observing, don't let the crown eat it before it becomes what it needs to become. He won't tell you that himself. He doesn't know how." Seraphine said nothing. She picked up her kit, redistributed between her bag and her coat pockets, lightened to what she could carry across rough terrain, and walked to the garrison entrance where Vaeric was waiting in the cold gray morning, his campaign pack on his back, his sword at his hip, looking like a man who has made a decision and has already moved past the making of it into the execution. She fell into step beside him, and they moved north away from the road into the rough terrain of the shepherd's track. Behind them, the garrison held what it could hold. Ahead of them, somewhere in the dark shape of what was coming, a capital was waiting without knowing it needed saving. And between them, on a mountain path that was barely a path at all, the distance that had existed since the plaza in Ashmere continued its slow, inexorable collapse. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them needed to. The track climbed into the high cold, and the morning moved around them, and Seraphine walked beside a king who had just lost the architecture of his trust, and found that in its wreckage, stripped of the managed distance and the performance of certainty, what remained was something she had not expected. Something real. Something that would survive the mountain. Whether it would survive what waited at the end of it was a question neither of them could yet answer. The shepherd's track was not a road. It was a suggestion, a series of decisions made by animals over generations, pressed into the mountain's flank by the accumulated weight of hooves and seasons, and it demanded a quality of attention that left no room for anything except the immediate problem of the next 3 feet of ground. Loose shale. Ice in the shadow of the north-facing rocks where the morning sun had not reached and would not reach. Elevation gain that made itself known in the lungs first and the legs second, in that order, without negotiation. Vaeric moved ahead and slightly left, which put him in position to catch her if the shale gave way, which she noted without comment because commenting on it would have required acknowledging that it was happening, and she suspected he was doing it without full conscious awareness. The protective instinct preceding the deliberate decision, the way instinct always precedes decision, in people who have spent enough time in dangerous environments. They did not talk on the climb. The altitude made talk expensive and the situation made silence functional, and they had reached, somewhere in the garrison over the past 8 hours, a register of communication that did not require constant verbal maintenance. She watched the rock. He watched the ridge above them. Neither of them needed to explain this arrangement. It was 2 hours before the track leveled into a narrow shelf above the tree line, and Vaeric stopped and turned to look back the way they had come, and Seraphine stopped beside him and looked too. The garrison was visible, small and gray in the morning light, a square of stone on the road's edge. Below it, in the tree line, nothing moved, nothing she could see, which was not the same as nothing being there. "They're still positioned," he said. "Yes," she said. "They'll see we've gone within the hour. They'll send men up after us." "How long do we have?" "This track is rough enough that it slows pursuit more than it slows us. Maybe an hour advantage. Maybe less." He turned back to the path ahead. "We need to move." They moved. Here is what the histories do not record about men like Vaeric Draven, because the histories are written after the fact by people who were not on the mountain. The particular quality of thought that operates in a man who is running out of options and knows it. It is not panic. Panic is the luxury of people who believe that the situation can still be escaped, that there is a version of events in which this does not happen, that the urgency is about finding the exit before it closes. Men who have operated at the edge of disaster long enough stop believing in exits as a category. What replaces panic is something colder and more functional, a stripping away of everything that is not the immediate problem, a narrowing of attention to the point of almost physical sensation, a quality of presence that people who have encountered it in other men sometimes describe as terrifying, and sometimes describe as extraordinary, and it is, in fact, both simultaneously. Vaeric was doing this on the mountain track, and Seraphine could feel it in the quality of his movement, in the way he processed the terrain ahead with a speed that had nothing inefficient in it. He was not a man fleeing, he was a man moving towards something, and the distinction was in every step. The track descended sharply after the shelf, switchbacking down the mountain's northern face into a different valley system than the road below. And the descent was harder than the climb because descent always is. The body's instinct running contrary to the movement required, the muscles fighting the grade, the eyes processing distance in ways they are not optimized for. She slipped once on a wet rock, and his hand was at her arm before she had fully registered the slip. And she found her footing, and he released her immediately, and neither of them said anything about it. The valley floor appeared after another hour. Pine trees denser here than on the roadside. The smell of cold water somewhere to the left. The track widened into something that was almost a path, and the going became easier in the specific way of things that become easier just before they become hard again for different reasons. They were half a mile from where the track joined the Keld approach road when Vaeric stopped. He had heard something. She could tell from the quality of his stillness. It was not the stillness of assessment, which she had catalogued, but the stillness of reception, of a man whose attention had sharpened to a point at something she had not yet perceived. Then she heard it too. Horses. More than two. Moving fast on the approach road ahead of them, from the direction of Keld. Vaeric moved her off the track and into the tree line in a single motion that was not rough, but was not gentle either, purely functional, and pressed into the trees beside her and went completely still. The horses came into view on the road below. 6 of them. Imperial colors, black and silver, but not the column's horses. Different animals, different riders. Coming from Keld at speed, which meant they had departed Keld before dawn, which meant they had been sent before the garrison commander in Keld could have known about the rockfall, which meant they had been sent for a different reason, or they had been sent by someone who already knew. Rethus, Vaeric said, barely a breath. The riders passed below and continued south, toward the mountain road and the garrison and the closed position where 30 soldiers with 2 days of supplies were waiting for riders that these riders were intended to intercept. Seraphine watched them go and felt the truth sight register nothing. They were too far, too fast. The perception didn't work across distance the way it worked in proximity. She could tell him nothing useful about them from here, but she could tell him what the situation meant. Thorn knows where the garrison is, she said. Those riders aren't reinforcements. They're a message. He's closing the net. Yes, Vaeric said. Sorvath. Yes, he said again, and the word came out with a quality she had not heard from him before. Not the contained grief of the road, not the managed weight of command. Something more immediate. Something that, in a man with less control over his face, would have been visible as fear. He had left 30 men, including his general of 12 years, in a garrison with 2 days of supplies and those riders at their back. He could not go back. Going back put everything at Thorn's mercy. Going forward was the only move that had any possibility of pulling something out of this situation. This is what leadership costs at the point where it stops being theoretical. You make the calculation, you move forward, and you carry the weight of the thing you moved away from in the exact same part of yourself where you carry everything else you cannot put down. It does not feel like strength. It does not feel like strategy. It feels exactly like what it is. Choosing the thing that might save more people at the cost of immediate, specific, named people you have known for years. The math works. The math always works. In the cold logic of strategic necessity. The math has never once made it easier. Vaeric came out of the trees and back onto the track and moved toward Keld at a pace that was no longer careful about the terrain. Seraphine followed. Keld was a garrison town, the kind that had grown up around military necessity and then accumulated civilian life in the way that accretions happen. Not planned, but inevitable. The town filling in the gaps left by the garrison's requirements. A market, a tavern, a smithy that served both the garrison and the farmers in the valley below. They came into it from the north track's end, which brought them out near the smithy, and Vaeric pulled his cloak hood forward and moved through the early morning street with the quality of a man accustomed to being recognizable who has learned the adjustments that make recognition less automatic. The garrison commander's name was Aldrin Foss, 20 years in the Northern Dominion service, a record that Sorvath had described as clean. A record that had been reviewed through the same intelligence chain that Rithis had been sitting in for 6 years. Vaeric went to the garrison gate and gave his name without ceremony, and the gate guard went rigid in the specific way of soldiers who have encountered the person they were not expecting to encounter and have not yet processed the implications. The garrison commander appeared within 4 minutes, a broad man of 50 with a gray beard and the look of someone for whom surprise was a professional irritation. "Your Grace," Foss said. "We weren't. No word reached us that you were." "No word will have reached you," Vaeric said. "I need your council room. Now." Seraphine stood beside him in the council room and watched Vaeric deliver the situation briefing with the economy of a man who has stripped every unnecessary element out of what he needs to communicate and is delivering the remainder at speed. The rockfall. The garrison. The riders from Keld heading south. The name Rethis. The financial record Sorvath had assembled, all of it precise and sequenced and utterly without the managed performance she had watched him maintain in Ashmere. There was no performance left. This was the operational core, moving at the speed the situation required. Foss listened with the expression of a man whose morning has just become significantly more consequential than he had prepared for. "The riders that left this garrison before dawn," Vaeric said. "Who authorized them?" Foss went very still. "A dispatch came in late last night from the coordination office in the capital, priority seal. It authorized a courier relay to the southern garrison road, said your column had been delayed and required supply support." "What priority seal? Council level?" Foss's jaw was working. "Council Rethis's office." The room was quiet. "The riders are not bringing supply support," Vaeric said. "They are closing a trap on my garrison. I need them recalled, now. Every horse you have, and riders who can intercept them before they reach the mountain road. If I recall them and it turns out the dispatch was legitimate—" "It is not legitimate," Vaeric said. "And if you need certainty before you move, tell me what you know and what you're not telling me, because we do not have the time for the version of this where you decide to be cautious." Foss looked at him. Then he looked at Seraphine, which was a thing people did when they were uncertain. They looked for a second reference point, another face to read. She met his gaze and he held it for a moment, and something in him settled, the specific settling of a man who has just made a decision. "There's been something wrong in the dispatch chain for 3 months, Foss said. "Routing anomalies, messages arriving with priority seals that the originating offices deny sending. I filed a report with the coordination office in Keld. It was acknowledged and nothing happened." "Because the coordination office routes through Rethis's staff," Vaeric said. "I didn't know that." "You know it now. Send the recall. Every rider you have." Foss went to the door and began giving orders, and the garrison outside became very loud, very quickly, the sound of a military installation shifting from routine to operational at speed. Seraphine stood in the council room and felt the moment shift around her, felt it the way she felt the quality of a wound changing under her hands, the texture of a situation moving from one state to another. "Ravengard," she said. Vaeric was at the council room's map table. "I'm sending riders in the next 20 minutes. 6 men, fastest horses Foss has. They'll reach the capital in— Rithis will see them coming." "Rithis is in Ravengard," Vaeric said. "He can't stop 6 riders without showing his hand." "He doesn't need to stop them. He needs to delay the response long enough for Thorn's forces to reach the capital." She came to the table and looked at the map. Ravengard marked at the northern mountain's peak, above the cloud line, the roads approaching it narrow and defensible. And she now understood, known to someone who had been in the council room for 6 years. Thorn doesn't need to breach the walls. He needs to get close enough that his terms are credible. He needs the image of an army at Ravengard's gates while the Alpha King is missing on a mountain road. Vaeric was looking at the map. He needs to move his forces into position before the riders reach the capital with the warning. How long does he have? If he moved when we left Ashmere, he did the calculation. She watched him do it. He's already moving. The council room door opened. Foss. Recall riders are out. 6 horses. Fastest we have. He paused. Your Grace, there's something else. A woman came to the garrison this morning, before dawn. She said she was from Ashmere. She said she had information about the Alpha King's column, and she was asking for the garrison commander. He paused again. I had her held. I wasn't sure of the protocol. Seraphine and Vaeric looked at each other. Bring her, Vaeric said. The woman was 60 years old and had walked through the night and looked like it. Her boots soaked through, her coat inadequate for the mountain cold, her face bearing the particular expression of someone who has committed to a course of action they are not entirely certain was rational and are too far into it to reconsider. Seraphine recognized her. Maret, who ran the dry goods store on the east side of Saltmarsh Lane and had been one of Seraphine's patients for a chronic joint condition that responded well to the salve she compounded from pine resin and willow bark. Maret, Seraphine said. Maret looked at her with a relief so complete it was almost physical. Seraphine. Good. Good. I wasn't sure. She looked at Vaeric with the expression of a civilian registering the presence of military authority, which was somewhere between wariness and desperate hope. Are you the king? You look like the king. I am, Vaeric said. Good, Mara said, again, with the satisfaction of someone checking a box. Then you need to hear this. She straightened her spine with an effort that made Seraphine's joints ache in sympathy. After your column left, 2 men came to Ashmere, before dawn this morning. They weren't imperial, no colors. They went to the governor's hall and they spoke with Governor Aldrich for an hour. I was in the hall. I cleaned the hall on Tuesdays, and this was Tuesday, and nobody told me not to be there, so I was there. She looked at Vaeric steadily. They told Aldrich that the Alpha King's column had been destroyed, that you were dead, that Ashmere needed to declare its position regarding the new order, which they described as Lord Thorne's consolidation of the southern and northern territories under a unified governance. The council room was very still. What did Aldrich say? Seraphine said. He asked for time to consider. Maret's expression carried something complicated. Which is Aldrich? He always asked for time to consider. But after they left, he found me. He knew I'd heard, and he told me to walk to Keld. He said walk, not ride, because horses are noticeable and a woman walking isn't, and he said to tell the garrison what I'd heard. She paused. He said to tell the Alpha King, if the Alpha King wasn't dead, that the story about his death was already moving south, that Thorne is using it as the justification to request border lords rally to his cause. The intelligence was precise. The intelligence was current. The intelligence was delivered by a 60-year-old woman with wet boots who had walked through the mountain night because a governor who had seemed to Seraphine like a man made of negotiation and accommodation had, when the moment required it, found the thing underneath the accommodation. Some people reveal themselves in crisis the way metal reveals its quality under heat. Aldrich had turned out, under the specific heat of Malrec Thorne's men sitting in his hall telling him the Alpha King was dead, to be a different kind of metal than he'd appeared. Vaeric looked at Seraphine. Something passed between them, not a look of confirmation, because she had not spoken, but a look of shared understanding that the shape of the situation had just changed again, and that the change was not entirely negative. He's not dead, Vaeric said to Maret, with a directness that was its own form of kindness. And Aldrich's information is what I needed. Thank you. Maret looked at him. Then she looked at Seraphine with the expression of someone who has done the thing they came to do and is only now allowing themselves to register how tired they are. Is there somewhere I can sit down? She said. Yes, Seraphine said. Come with me. She got Maret settled in the garrison's medical room with hot food and dry boots from the supply stores, and spent 7 minutes reassessing the joint condition, because old habits are old habits, and because Maret had walked through the night on joints that were not designed for that particular challenge. When she came back to the council room, Vaeric was standing at the map with Foss and 2 of the garrison's senior officers, and the map now had marks on it that had not been there before, positions, Routes. The particular geometry of a commander who has been given a clearer picture of the situation and is now building a response to it. He looked up when she entered. Thorn's claim that I'm dead gives us something. She came to the table. He doesn't know you're here. He knows I'm not in the garrison on the mountain road. He doesn't know I made it off the mountain. His last confirmed intelligence about my position is the rockfall. He looked at the map. Which means he's moving toward Ravengard on the assumption that I'm contained. He's committed to the timetable. And if he finds out you're not contained, he accelerates. He tries to reach the capital before I can. Which means the riders I've sent need to move Ravengard's defenses before Thorn's forces are in range, she finished. 6 riders, Foss said. Against a timetable we don't know exactly. We know enough, Vaeric said. Mara's information puts Thorn's messengers in Ashmere this morning, which means his forces left their staging position last night. He traced the route on the map. They're coming through the Gravast approach. It's the only road wide enough for a significant force. They're 2 days out from Ravengard at standard military pace. My riders can make it in 1 day if they push. He looked at Foss. What's your garrison strength? 80 full soldiers, another 40 in support capacity. And your fastest horses. All of them. Not just the 6 I've already sent. How many? Foss counted something internal. 30 that can sustain a hard pace. Vaeric straightened from the map. He made the decision in the space of 2 seconds and communicated it in 3 sentences, which was how he operated when the time for deliberation was over and the time for commitment had arrived. I'm taking 20 of your horses and 15 of your soldiers. The rest stays here with you. I'm going to Ravengard through the High Pass. It's a harder route, but it doesn't intersect Thorn's approach. He looked at Foss. If Thorn's forces come through Keld, you hold as long as you can. You don't engage unless they move on the town. You delay. Understood, Foss said. My garrison on the mountain road. When your recall riders reach them, I'll send supply wagons behind the riders. Everything we can load in an hour. Vaeric nodded once. He turned to Seraphine. His face was the clear, stripped-down face she had come to understand as his version of honesty. Not the managed performance, not the controlled distance, but the functional reality of a man at the center of a situation he is committed to resolving. You don't have to come further. You can stay here. Foss will keep you safe and— Stop, she said. He stopped. I need to be in Ravengard, she said. You know why. Rithus is there. The council is there. Every decision you make in the next 48 hours is going to require you to know whether the people around you are telling you the truth. She met his eyes without flinching. You know I'm right. He looked at her for a moment, then, It's going to be a hard ride. I rode through a mountain ambush yesterday. I'll manage a hard ride. Something moved through his expression. Not the almost smile she had catalogued before. Something more direct than that. Something that was not managed at all. Get a fresh horse from Foss. Anything you need from the medical stores, take it. We leave in 20 minutes. He turned back to the map and she turned toward the door, and she heard him say quietly, in the voice he used when he was not projecting for an audience, to the space behind her. Thank you. For Vaeric. For all of it. She walked out without turning around because some things are easier to receive if you don't look directly at them. They rode hard. 15 soldiers, 2 horses each in rotation. Vaeric's insistence, the mark of a man who understood that the bottleneck was the horses rather than the riders, and planned accordingly. The High Pass was exactly as hard as its name suggested. A route that gained elevation quickly and held it, the kind of road that in summer would have been difficult and in early cold was something adjacent to punishing. The horse's breath came in white bursts. The riders did not talk. There was nothing to say that was not already understood. Seraphine rode and assessed the horizon and let her mind do what it did under pressure, the quiet analytical function that kept running regardless of the body's condition, processing what she knew against what she needed to know. Rithus. A man she had never met, sitting in the capital she had never seen, with 6 years of access to strategic briefings, and the particular power of someone whose compromise is invisible because they are themselves the system designed to detect it. She had never encountered a deception that large. She had encountered many small ones, the patient who understated their pain, the merchant who overstated his need, the governor who said what was expected rather than what was true. The texture of each was distinct. The texture of 6 years of systematic, patient, embedded betrayal was something she had not yet felt, and she did not know how it would register. And she did not know if the truth sight was capable of processing it cleanly, or if its scale would obscure it the way too much light can obscure detail as effectively as darkness. She did not say this to Vaeric. It was not useful to him before they arrived. After they arrived was when it would matter. The pass peaked in early afternoon, and from its height she could see, far south below the cloud layer, the smear of activity that could have been many things, but at this distance and scale was most probably a military force in movement. Not visible as individuals, visible as a texture on the landscape, the particular quality of organized human movement in number. Thorn's forces, moving toward a city that was, as of this morning, being told its king was dead. She did not point it out. Vaeric had already seen it. She knew from the quality of his stillness on the horse beside her, that specific, active stillness that meant he was processing something he had already accounted for and was moving through rather than reacting to. They descended. Ravengard appeared in the late afternoon light on the northern peak, exactly as the stories had described and nothing like what she had imagined, which was always the way with things that have been described often enough to accumulate legend. It was built from black stone, which the afternoon light turned to something between iron and dark amber, and it rose from the cliff's edge with the particular certainty of something that had been in its position for so long it had become geological. The wolf banners, black and silver, the same as the columns, the same as the garrison, moved in the mountain wind above the highest tower. Vaeric looked at it the way men look at the things they have been fighting toward, and finally reached, and the sight confirms both the rightness of the fight and the cost of it. She watched his face and saw something there that was not performance and not management. Something close. They were 2 miles from the city gate when the rider came out to meet them. A single horse, hard and fast, and the rider pulled up in a spray of gravel and ice, and Seraphine saw from his armor that he was royal guard, the inner guard, Ravengard's own, and his face had the quality of someone carrying information they wish they were not carrying. "Your Grace," he was breathing hard. "You're alive." "Yes," Vaeric said. "Report. Council Rethus moved 3 hours ago. He called an emergency council session, presented information that the column had been destroyed and your death confirmed by a rider from the mountain road." The Royal Guard's jaw was tight. He called for a vote on emergency succession protocols and interim governance. He has 4 council votes confirmed. "And the other 3? Lord Cassin refused to vote without confirmation of your death. Lady Mira abstained and has been in her chambers since. General Aldrich," the writer paused. A different kind of pause. "General Aldrich was removed from the council session by Rethus's order. He is currently held in the East Wing." Vaeric's face did something that was very controlled and very fast, and resolved into something that was neither cold nor hot, but was the temperature of a decision that has been made and does not require further processing. "Rethus's 4 votes, he said. "Enough for interim succession?" "Under the emergency protocol, yes. He needs 5 for full succession transfer. He's been working the 5th vote for the past 2 hours. "Who is the 5th? "Lord Vane," the writer said. "He's been in private session with Rethus since midday. We don't know what's been offered." Vaeric looked at Ravengard above them on the cliff, at the wolf banners moving in the wind, at the city he had built from a fractured coalition through 15 years of decisions that had each cost something, stacked in the particular architecture of a man who had believed the architecture would hold. He looked at Seraphine, not for strategic consultation, not for truth sight assessment. He looked at her the way people look at the one fixed point in a landscape that is moving. "When we go through that gate," he said, "Rethus will know immediately that the succession vote is void. He will know I'm alive. He will know everything he has built in the past 6 years is about to come down." He held her gaze. "He will do something. I don't know what. Something fast." "I know," she said. "What I need from you." "I know what you need," she said. "I'll be in the room. Whatever room it is, I'll be there." He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned to the Royal Guard. "Right ahead. Tell no one I'm coming. Get me to the council chamber before Rethus's session reconvenes." The rider turned his horse. Vaeric looked at his 15 soldiers. "We go in fast. The gate guards are loyal," said. "I trained them myself." Anyone who tries to stop us between the gate and the council chamber is not loyal." He paused. "Move." They moved. The gate came up fast, the black stone arch with its iron-fanged portcullis raised, the guards inside already reacting to the royal guard rider who had preceded them. Seraphine rode through the arch of Raven Guard for the first time in her life at speed, with the sound of hooves on the stone courtyard and the smell of the city, coal smoke and pine resin and the particular cold of altitude, hitting her all at once. No time to absorb it, no time to register any of it as the thing it was. Through the courtyard, through the inner gate, up the road toward the Citadel's main entrance, where the royal guard was already holding the doors, and the soldiers inside were doing the specific, rapid recalibration of men who are processing that the king, they were told was dead, is very much alive and currently riding toward them at a pace that suggests he has significant opinions about the past 3 hours. The council chamber was on the Citadel's second floor. She knew this from the rider's description. She had never been inside this building before. She followed Vaeric up the stairs and through the corridor, and she heard through the chamber doors before they opened the sound of voices, formal, structured, the particular cadence of procedural governance, and underneath it a quality of tension that was palpable even through thick wood. Vaeric put his hand on the door. He paused for one breath. Not hesitation. A moment of arrival, of acknowledging what was on the other side and what it meant to go through it. Then he opened the door. The council chamber of Raven Guard was a long room of dark wood and stone, lit by iron chandeliers, with a table that could seat 20 and currently held 9 people in various states of a procedural vote. At the table's far end, standing with the authority of a man who has spent 6 years engineering this exact moment, was Council Rethus. He was older than she'd expected. 60, perhaps, with the careful grooming of someone for whom appearance was professional strategy. His face, when the door opened and he registered what he was seeing, did something extraordinary. He smiled. Not the smile of a man whose plan has failed, the smile of a man who had anticipated this contingency and prepared for it. "Your Grace," Rethus said, into the silence of the frozen chamber. "I'm gratified you survived. It will make the next step considerably cleaner." He raised his hand, and the 4 guards who had been standing in the chamber's corners, not royal guard, not in Raven Guard's black and silver, in colors Seraphine had not yet learned to read, moved toward Vaeric. The council chamber erupted. Seraphine had 2 seconds, in the eruption, in the noise and the movement and the sharp sounds of soldiers doing what soldiers do when orders are given. 2 seconds to read Rethus across the length of the table. She pushed the truth sight forward with everything she had, the full directed force of it, not passive reception but active reach, the way she pressed into a wound to understand its depth. What she felt staggered her, not the texture of a man lying about facts, not the deception she had learned to read in the plaza, the wrongness of information being selectively withheld. Something larger and more organized than that. A mind that had spent so long constructing a version of events that the construction had become its own kind of truth. A man who had told himself a story for 6 years about justice, about balance, about the necessity of what he was doing, until the story had calcified into something he experienced as real. Rethus was not lying. Rethus believed himself. And that was, she understood in those 2 seconds, the most dangerous thing she had ever felt. Because a man who believes his own story cannot be broken by exposure the way a liar can. A liar fears the truth because they know the gap between what they've said and what is real. A man who has rewritten reality has no gap to fear. Vaeric had 3 guards on him and was handling this with the efficiency she had watched on the mountain road. But there were 4 guards, and the chamber was a confined space, and Rethus was already moving toward the door at the chamber's far end. The door that led, she did not know where, she did not know this building, somewhere. She looked at the council members frozen at the table, 8 of them, 1 seat empty, Aldrich held in the east wing. She saw among the 8 a woman whose face was rigid with something that was not shock. Lady Mira, she thought, who had abstained, who had been in her chambers. And at the table's near end, an older man whose expression was doing something complicated and rapid, a man in the process of deciding something. Lord Vane, the 5th vote, still uncommitted. She walked toward him, not toward the fight, toward the man at the table who had not yet decided which side of this he was on. She sat in the empty chair beside him. "Lord Vane," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man trying to read a situation too large for the categories he'd brought to it. "My name is Seraphine Vale," she said. "I am the king's truth speaker. I need you to listen to me for 30 seconds. And I need you to know that I cannot lie to you, and I need you to decide in those 30 seconds whether you believe that." Behind her, the sound of the chamber in conflict. Vane looked at her. "Rethus believes what he's telling you," she said. "That's the first thing. He has constructed a story so completely that it feels like truth to him, which means he has told it to you without the quality of deception you would normally detect in a man trying to manipulate you. That is why you have been uncertain. That is why the fifth vote has been difficult." She held his gaze with everything she had. "The second thing is this. Thorn's forces are 2 days from this city. The king is alive and in this room. The choice you make in the next 60 seconds will determine whether Ravengard survives the next 48 hours with its leadership intact or fractured." She leaned forward. "I am not asking you to trust the king. I am asking you to trust what you can see in front of you. He rode through a mountain ambush, a closed road, and half the night to get to this room. That is not the behavior of a man whose claim to this throne is a performance." Vane looked at her. Then he looked past her, toward the conflict at the chamber's center, toward Vaeric. 3 guards on him, 2 of them now significantly worse for the engagement, the third one reconsidering his position, and toward the door at the far end through which Rethus had disappeared. Then Vane stood up. He moved to the center of the chamber, and his voice came out with the particular authority of a man who has made a decision and is done being uncertain. "The vote is void. The Alpha King is present and alive. I am withdrawing my consideration of the 5th vote and calling for an immediate session hold." The chamber went very still. The remaining guard dropped his hands. Vaeric, breathing hard, blood from a cut on his jaw that he had not had before, looked across the chamber at Seraphine with an expression she would not find a complete word for until much later. The chamber door at the far end opened. Rethus came back through it. He was not alone. He had a vial in his hand, dark glass, something inside it that moved with a viscosity that was not water, not any liquid she recognized, and the quality of his smile had changed. It was the smile of a man who has reached the contingency he prepared for the contingency. "I wondered," Rethus said, "if you'd make it back." He looked at the vial in his hand with something that was almost scholarly. "Thorn's alchemist is quite gifted. This compound is specific. It targets the particular physiology of alpha rulers, something in the dominant structure, the heightened endocrine function." He looked at Vaeric. "It doesn't work on ordinary men. On a man like you, it is, I'm told, quite final." The chamber had gone completely still. Seraphine was between Rethus and Vaeric. She had not planned to be. She had moved without deciding to move in the same way she had moved in the garrison yard in Ashmere. Instinct preceding deliberation, the body acting on information the mind had not yet fully processed. She stood in the space between them and looked at Rethus and pushed the truth sight forward again, past the constructed reality, past the 6 years of self-authored story, looking for the thing underneath. And she found it. Not truth, not lies. Something more fundamental than either. Fear. Rethus was afraid. He was afraid of what had happened when this failed. Not afraid of Vaeric. Afraid of Thorn. Afraid of what Thorn would do to a man who had been useful and had now become an embarrassment. He had built 6 years of betrayal on the premise that Thorn would win, and in this room, with the Alpha King alive and the vote void and his guards compromised, the premise was failing, and the fear of being on the losing side of a gamble. This large was doing something to his face that all the composed certainty in the world could not entirely contain. "You're afraid of him," Seraphine said into the chamber's silence. "Not of the king, of Thorn. You've been afraid of him since the beginning. That's why you built the story. That's why you convinced yourself this was necessary, because the alternative, refusing him 6 years ago when he first approached you, was something you believed would cost you more than compliance." Rethus's expression fractured, just slightly, just enough. "You chose the wrong man to be afraid of," she said, "and I think you know that now." The vial was still in his hand. Vaeric was 3 steps away. The chamber was still. Everything that was going to happen next was balanced on the edge of the next 3 seconds, and Seraphine stood in the middle of it with no weapon and no armor and nothing except the thing she had been born with and could not put down. And she looked at Rethus and she said, quietly enough that it was only for him, "Put it down. There's still a version of this where you survive it, but only if you put it down right now." Rethus looked at her. His hand shook. Rethus put the vial down. Not dramatically. Not with the collapse of a man whose performance has finally broken. He set it on the council table with the careful precision of someone who has made a calculation and is executing the result of it, and the sound it made against the dark wood was very small for something that had held the room's entire weight for 30 seconds. The chamber breathed. Vaeric moved first, not toward Rethus, toward the vial, covering the distance in 2 steps and closing his hand around the dark glass with the controlled efficiency of someone removing a variable from the equation. He handed it to the soldier at his left without looking at it again. Then he straightened and looked at Rethus across the length of the table and said nothing, because there are moments where speech would be a diminishment of what the silence already contains. Rethus sat down. The quality of his sitting was the quality of a man whose legs have decided before the rest of him that the standing was finished. His face had the particular hollowness of someone who has been maintaining a structure under enormous internal pressure for a very long time and has just stopped maintaining it. And what is left when the pressure releases is not peace, but the exhaustion underneath the pressure that the pressure had been obscuring. Seraphine stepped back from the center of the room. She moved to the wall and stood there and let the situation proceed without her managing it, because this part was not hers to manage. Lord Vane called the session to order with the particular authority of a man who has found, in the middle of a crisis, that he is more capable than he had assessed himself to be. The 4 compromised guards were removed. 2 council members who had voted with Rethus under evident coercion were invited to formally retract, which they did with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for the opportunity. General Aldrich was retrieved from the East Wing and arrived in the chamber with a bruise developing along his jaw and the expression of a man who is deeply, specifically angry and is managing it professionally. Vaeric stood at the head of the table and let the procedural reassembly happen around him and said very little. He was bleeding from the cut on his jaw and had not addressed this. Seraphine from the wall watched the blood dry and said nothing about it yet, because yet was not the right time. Rethus, when asked to account for himself, spoke with the exhausted honesty of a man who has already moved through the part of this where denying things was available to him. He named Thorn. He named the first contact 6 years prior, and the nature of what had been requested and what had been offered in exchange. He named the specific intelligence he had passed and the methods he had used to conceal the passing of it. He was precise and detailed, and completely without the composed certainty he had walked into this chamber with, and what replaced the certainty was something that Seraphine recognized from the garrison. The flatness of a man telling everything because the carrying is over. She listened and registered. Clean. All of it clean. Rethus was done constructing. What was left was inventory. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a long time. Then Vaeric said, "What did he promise you?" Rethus looked up. Governance of the Northern Territories under his consolidated rule. An administrative position. He said the Northern Dominion's model was too costly to maintain, too much military expenditure, too much political management of too many border lords. He said a unified governance under Southern leadership would be more stable, more sustainable. He paused. He was persuasive. "He's had practice," Vaeric said. "Yes." Rethus looked at his hands. By the time I understood fully what I had agreed to, I had already given him enough to make refusal more dangerous than continuation. "The trap you set for yourself," Vaeric said, "by taking the first step." "Yes." "You believed he would win." Rethus looked at him directly. "For most of those 6 years, yes. I believed the Northern Dominion was too brittle to survive sustained pressure. I believed the Border Lord coalition would fracture. I believed—" He stopped. Something moved through his face. "I was wrong." The words sat in the room without anyone adding to them. This is the particular weight of institutional betrayal when it finally speaks. It does not sound like villainy. It sounds like a series of decisions made by a person who was afraid and extrapolated from that fear into a future they were certain was coming and made accommodations to survive in it. The horror is not in the malice. There is not enough malice in Rethus to account for what he has done. The horror is in the ordinariness of it. A frightened man. A persuasive offer. a first step that made the second inevitable. An architecture of compromise built one careful stone at a time over 6 years, until the architecture was the only thing he knew how to maintain. Power does not corrupt exclusively through ambition. Sometimes it corrupts through fear of losing proximity to it. Sometimes the most dangerous people in any system are not the ones who want more, but the ones who are terrified of having less, and who will pay any price to ensure their position survives what they are certain is coming. Rithus had looked at the Northern Dominion and seen fragility. He had made the bet that Thorn would win, and had invested himself in that bet so completely that by the time the bet began to look like the wrong one, he was already in too deep to exit cleanly. He had not been wrong about the fragility. He had been wrong about who could hold it. Seraphine thought about this, standing at the wall, and thought about what it meant for the thing that came next. The riders Vaeric had sent from Keld arrived at Ravengard in the early evening, the fastest of them making the journey in a time that would be discussed in the garrison for years afterward. They brought confirmation of what the council session had already begun to address. Thorn's forces on the Grey Vast approach, the timetable, the scale. Vaeric convened a war council at dusk with a speed that had the quality of someone who had been organizing this meeting in his head for the past 12 hours and was now simply speaking the version of it that had been already built. Lord Vane was at the table, and General Aldrich, jaw bruised, attention undivided, and the garrison commanders, and 2 of the border lords whose loyalty was unquestioned, who had arrived with their own contingents on the strength of the morning's riders. Seraphine was in the room. She had not been invited specifically. She had positioned herself at the end of the table with her kit and the medical assessment she had been building since Vaeric's jaw injury. And nobody had asked her to leave. And she understood that nobody would ask her to leave, because Vaeric knew exactly what she was doing there and had said nothing, which was its own kind of invitation. She listened to the council with the dual attention she had developed over the past 2 days. The surface attention that tracked the tactical discussion, and the deeper attention that read the air in the room for the quality of what was being said against the quality of what was true. She said nothing for most of the session. She made one correction, quietly, when a border lord claimed his garrison strength at a number that registered wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not a deliberate inflation, but the rounding up of a man who had not taken a precise count recently and was presenting his best estimate as confirmed data. "My lord," she said, "the Eastern Garrison's last verified count was 83, not 90. I'd use the verified number for the planning." The border lord looked at her, then at Vaeric. Vaeric said nothing, which was the appropriate response, and the border lord revised the number and the planning continued. After that, nobody in the room said anything that they were uncertain about, as if they were certain about it. The battle plan that emerged from the War Council was not elegant. Elegance is a quality of plans made with full information and sufficient resources and time to refine them. This plan was built from what was available, which was less than anyone wanted and more than Thorn was expecting, because Thorn's intelligence about Ravengard's current state was 6 hours old and had been generated by a source who was now sitting in a guarded room in the Citadel's lower level, and a great deal had changed in 6 hours. At the end of the session, when the commanders had dispersed to their positions, and the chamber had emptied of everyone except Vaeric and Seraphine and the 2 soldiers who stood permanent watch at the door, she finally crossed the room to him and opened her kit and addressed the jaw. He sat still for it, as he had on the mountain, with the quality of someone who has learned to accept medical attention without making it into a confrontation. The cut was not serious. It had dried badly and would scar if it wasn't managed, and she cleaned it and dressed it in silence, and he held the silence with her. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the room was very quiet around them. "Tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's going to be ugly. Most necessary things are." He was quiet for a moment. "When I was 22 years old, I fought my first real battle. Not a skirmish, a real engagement. 2 forces, a day-long fight. I was terrified for the first hour, and then something else took over, and I was not terrified anymore. I've never been sure whether what took over was courage or simply the exhaustion of fear." He looked at his hands. "For a long time, I thought it was the same thing, that courage was just fear that had run out of runway." "And now?" she said. He looked at her. "Now I think courage is something different. I think it's the decision to act in full knowledge of the cost, rather than in the absence of it." He paused. "You've been costing me certainties since the plaza in Ashmere. I want you to know I'm aware of that. I know, she said. Is that a complaint? No, he said. It's the opposite of a complaint. He held her gaze with the directness she had come to understand as his version of vulnerability. Not the softness of a man who does not guard himself, but the opening of a man who has decided, in this specific context, that the guard is the wrong tool. Whatever this is, between us, whatever has been happening since the garrison in Ashmere, I need you to know that I know what it is. I'm not going to pretend I don't know, because you would read the pretense. Yes, she said, and I'm not going to say what it is tonight, because tonight has a specific function, and adding that to it is not something I'm willing to do to you. But after, he held her gaze. After, she agreed. He nodded once and looked back at his hands, and she looked at the map on the table, and the two of them sat in the council chamber of Ravengard in the quiet before the thing that was coming, and the quiet had a quality she would remember for the rest of her life. Not peaceful exactly, not calm, but complete. The quality of a moment that has everything in it that it needs and nothing that doesn't belong. Thorn's forces arrived at Ravengard's approach 2 hours before dawn. They came with torches, a river of light moving up the mountain road in the dark, visible from the citadel's highest point as something that at a distance could have been beautiful and at proximity was the opposite of beautiful. They came with siege equipment, 2 catapults, assembled on the approach road with the efficiency of men who had been planning this for long enough that the assembly was muscle memory. They came with a herald who rode to the gate under a flag of parley and delivered Thorn's terms in the formal language of ultimatum: surrender, abdication, and the opening of the gates, or the bombardment of Ravengard's walls, and the destruction of everything inside them. The herald had not been told that the Alpha King was alive and inside the walls with the War Council's plan fully in motion. This was, strategically speaking, one of the most important pieces of information that Thorn did not have. Vaeric let the bombardment begin. This sounds from the outside like a decision of extraordinary coldness. It was, in fact, a decision of extraordinary precision. 2 catapults firing on Ravengard's outer walls do not breach Ravengard's outer walls. They generate noise and fire and the perception of overwhelming force, and that perception is a weapon that works only as long as the person inside the walls believes it accurately represents the situation. The moment the person inside the walls demonstrates that they are neither overwhelmed nor intimidated, that they have been waiting, that they have a plan, that the catapults have achieved nothing except giving Ravengard time to confirm Thorn's force positions, the weapon stops working. The first catapult round hit the outer wall and the stone absorbed it, and Ravengard held, which it had been holding for 2 centuries and had been built specifically to continue doing. Vaeric opened the eastern gate, not in surrender, in deployment. The force that came out of the eastern gate was not Ravengard's full defensive strength. It was a third of it, 200 soldiers, cavalry leading, moving fast and low on the approach road's curve, using the terrain Vaeric had studied on maps since adolescence, hitting Thorn's siege positions from the angle that the siege positions had been set up specifically not to defend, because the siege positions had been set up for a stationary target that was not moving toward them. The catapults were out of action within 20 minutes. Seraphine was not on the battlefield. She was in the Citadel's lower hall, which had been converted to a field medical station, working with the garrison's 2 healers and 3 medically trained soldiers on the preparation she had insisted on the night before. Supplies organized, workspaces arranged, triage protocols established. She had argued for this preparation the way she argued for everything she argued for, which was directly and without softening the reality. And the garrison healers had listened with the attentiveness of people recognizing someone who understood the material. The wounded began arriving 30 minutes in. Not heavily. Vaeric's planning had been accurate, the force position solid, and Thorn's forces had the disadvantage of commanders who had prepared for a siege and encountered a sortie. But there are always wounded. This is the one constant of organized violence, the one thing that does not change with better planning or more favorable terrain or superior strategic positioning. There are always wounded. She worked. This is what she knew how to do. This is what she had been doing since she was 12 years old in a limestone building on Saltmarsh Lane. And the scale had changed and the context had changed, and the stones around her were black citadel walls instead of crumbling provincial limestone. But the work was the same. You assess. You prioritize. You use your hands. You do not spend the time that belongs to the wound in front of you on the wounds that are not yet in front of you. The battle lasted 4 hours, long enough for dawn to arrive and make the mountain road visible as the thing it actually was. A conflict between a force that had been preparing for a siege and a garrison that had been preparing for a sortie, and the sortie had moved first. Thorn's numbers were larger. They were not organized for this. The organization they had built was for a different situation, and reorganizing a military force in the middle of an engagement that has already gone wrong is one of the most difficult things a commander can attempt. And Malrek Thorn had not yet appeared on the battlefield, which told Seraphine, receiving wounded in the Citadel Hall and conducting the triage assessment she had been asked to conduct, something about the kind of commander he was. He had sent his men ahead. He had remained at the rear. This is the particular failure of men who have built empires of manipulation rather than direct engagement. When the manipulation stops working, they do not have the instincts of men who have been on the ground because they have never been on the ground. Thorn had built 6 years of architecture. He had recruited, compromised, positioned, planned. He had not led a sortie. He did not know how to respond to one in real time. And the generals he had selected were generals selected for their willingness to follow instructions rather than their capacity for independent battlefield decision-making, which in a planned siege was an asset and in a developing sortie was a critical liability. Vaeric found him at the rear of the Thorn formation 3 hours into the engagement, which is to say Vaeric moved through the battlefield with the same quality she had watched on the mountain road. The directional certainty, the absolute commitment to the next step, and reached the place where Thorn had been coordinating and found him there with 6 bodyguards and the expression of a man who is realizing that every contingency he planned for has failed to account for the contingency of a king who should have been trapped on a mountain road being very much present and moving toward him. She heard about this part later from Vane, who had ridden with the second sortie wave and had been close enough to observe it. He described it with the particular care of a man who is trying to be accurate about something he found difficult to fully process. Thorn tried to negotiate. This was, in retrospect, both completely predictable and completely revealing. A man who has spent his career in the architecture of leverage attempts leverage even when leverage is no longer available, because it is the only tool he has. He offered information, names of other compromised officials, in the capital and in the border territories, people Rethus had not named, a list that would have genuine value. He offered the withdrawal of his forces. He offered acknowledgement of the Northern Dominion's sovereignty in exchange for his own life and the lives of his men. Vaeric listened to the full offer. Then he said, "The people at Coldvale Pass." Thorn went very still. 200 people, Vaeric said. Not soldiers, not political opponents. Citizens who happened to be traveling through a pass at a time when someone needed an incident. Tell me their names. Thorn did not know their names. No, Vaeric said, you wouldn't. And he called for Thorn's capture, because killing him cleanly was a mercy that 200 unnamed people had not received, and what Malrek Thorn was owed was not a battlefield death that could be described in future years as honorable. He was owed a reckoning in front of the people he had claimed to be liberating, and that reckoning required him to be alive to answer for it. The bodyguards calculated the mathematics of the situation and came to the correct conclusion, which was that 6 men could not change the outcome, and there was no point in dying to attempt it. Thorn surrendered. The battle was over by full morning. The wounded had been accounted for. The dead, 18 on Ravengard's side, more than 50 from Thorn's forces, with the balance of his army in controlled surrender, had been given the respect that the immediate situation could offer. It was not enough. It was never enough. Seraphine had learned this early and had never found a way to make it sit comfortably, which she had decided was appropriate. Comfort with preventable death was not a quality she wanted to develop. She was cleaning her workspace in the medical hall, the mechanical end-of-session work that she did the same way every time, regardless of the setting, when she heard the particular quality of movement that preceded his arrival and looked up. Vaeric was in the doorway. His armor had taken damage, a deep gouge across the chest piece that had not gone through but had come close, and he had blood on his hands that was not his own. He was standing in the doorway with the look of a man who has come from one environment into another and is making the adjustment, and the adjustment was taking a moment. She looked at him steadily. Are you hurt? No. The armor didn't go through. He came into the hall and stopped a few feet from her. How many? 18 from our side. 12 serious wounds. 6 of those I'm uncertain about. They'll need monitoring for the next 2 days. She watched his face absorb this. Your plan was good. The triage count is significantly lower than it would have been with a static defense. 18, he said. Yes. He said nothing for a moment. She understood that the number was being placed somewhere specific, in the inventory that a man who has been making these decisions for 15 years carries with the particular permanence of things that do not diminish with time. Every death in service of a decision you made sits in you forever. This is the cost of command that nobody names in the commissions or the ceremonies, because naming it would make fewer people willing to hold the position, and the position has to be held. So it is understood and not stated, and the men and women who carry it privately, and the weight accumulates, and the carrying is what separates the ones who should hold power from the ones who simply want it. The ones who should hold it feel the weight. They do not stop feeling it. They carry it anyway. Come here, Seraphine said, and pulled a stool from beside the workspace and indicated it. He sat. She checked his hands. The blood was from the engagement, scrapes and stress on the knuckles from the particular violence of close combat, nothing that needed significant work. She cleaned them anyway, because the cleaning was not just mechanical, and he let her because the letting was not just medical. Thorn, he said while she worked. I heard, she said. Vane told me. He'll stand trial, in the open, before the border lords and the council and anyone who wants to hear it. His voice had the quality it had when he was stating something that had been decided and was now simply being communicated. The people at Coldvale Pass will have their names read into the record of the proceedings, every one of them that can be found. That's the minimum. Yes, she said. Rithis will stand trial also. Different proceeding. What he did was different in kind from what Thorn did, even if the outcome is related. He paused. I don't know yet what the right outcome is for him. I know what the law says. I know what I said in the council chamber about what survives. Domination. Trust. I need to think about what those 2 things require in his case. He looked at her. I may want your read on that, when we've both slept. Yes, she said again. There's something else, he said. The bond. She went still. Her hand stopped moving on his. She had not spoken to him about what she had felt in the garrison. The truth site's registration of him changing, the wrongness that had pulsed in the plaza and diminished over the mountain road and was now entirely absent. She had been waiting for the right time, and the right time had not been available because every available moment had been occupied by the immediate problem. I know something has been happening, he said. I don't have the truth site. I can't feel what you feel. But I've been aware of you. In a way I don't have prior experience of. Since the garrison, it's been clearer. He held her gaze steadily. I pulled the imperial records in Keld, historical records, the founding of the empire, the original compact between alpha rulers and the truth speaker line. He paused. They described a bond, not a legend, a documented functional phenomenon. 2 capacities that complement each other in specific ways when they're in proximity long enough under conditions of, they used the word crisis. I think crisis is doing a lot of work in that description. Seraphine looked at him. I've been feeling it since Ashmere, she said. The truth site reads deception as a wrongness in the air around a person. You registered it in the plaza. By the time we reached Keld, it was gone. There's nothing wrong in the air around you anymore. She held his gaze. I don't know what that means completely, but I know what it isn't. It isn't the truth site failing, it's reading something different. What is it reading? He said. She looked at him. This man who had ridden through a mountain ambush and a closed road and a war council and a 4-hour battle, and was sitting in front of her in a converted medical hall with blood on his armor and the weight of 18 dead in his face, and asking her, with the directness of someone who has run out of the capacity for anything except honesty, what she perceived. It's reading the absence of the gap, she said, between what you present and what you are. The gap is what registers as wrong. When someone is telling the truth completely, there's nothing to register. She paused. You have been becoming more honest since the plaza. Not in the sense of what you say, in the sense of what you are, in proximity to what you allow yourself to be. The gap has been closing. She met his eyes steadily. That's what the bond is, I think. That's the functional phenomenon. Not a compulsion, not a magical mechanism. It's what happens when two people who see accurately and feel accurately spend enough time together in conditions that strip the performance away. The hall was very quiet. And the historical records, he said carefully, the bonded pairs, what happened to them? They ruled together, she said, the ones that lasted. I want that, Vaeric said, and the words came out without the management, without the control, with the plainness of something too important to dress in anything other than itself. I want you to stay, not as the king's truth speaker, not under the compact, because I am asking you to stay. He held her gaze. I understand if what I am, what this is, what the past 3 days have been, I understand if the honest answer is no. I can receive a no from you. I cannot receive a managed answer that isn't true. Seraphine looked at the king of the northern dominion, who had come to Ashmere to find her before someone worse did, and had taken her through a mountain ambush and a garrison and a war council and the first genuine siege of Ravengard in 40 years, and who was sitting in a medical hall with damaged armor and clean hands, asking her to stay in the plainest language he had. She could feel the absence of any wrongness in the air around him, complete truth, raw and uncomplicated. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment as if checking the register of the word. Yes, she said again. I'm staying. Not because I was taken here under ancient law, because I choose to be here. Those are different things, and you know they're different things, and so do I. Yes, he said. They are. He reached out and took her hand, the hand that had cleaned his, that had worked through the garrison yard and the mountain track and the medical hall, and held it with a careful deliberateness that was not the grip of possession, but the grip of someone who understands the weight of what they are holding and intends to hold it accordingly. They sat like that in the converted medical hall while the morning moved around Ravengard, and the mountain wind came through the stone and the sounds of the aftermath, orderly, controlled, the particular sounds of a crisis that has passed and is being managed, came through the walls. The trial of Malrek Thorn was held 6 weeks later in the open courtyard of Ravengard, which had been configured for the purpose, with the particular care given to events that are meant to be witnessed rather than merely recorded. The border lords came. Representatives from the southern territories came, many of them with the expressions of people who have been discovering what their leader had been doing on their behalf without their knowledge, which is one of the more uncomfortable discoveries a person can make, and which, in Seraphine's experience, tended to produce one of two responses: denial, or the specific anger of someone who feels their trust has been instrumentalized. Most of them arrived with the specific anger. She stood beside Vaeric for the duration of it, not performing any particular function. Present, which was itself a function, and she understood that it was understood as one. Thorn stood in the courtyard in the cold light and heard the names read aloud. The names of the people at Coldvale Pass, everyone that the investigators had been able to reconstruct from the records, and the survivors and the families who had submitted testimony in the weeks since the battle. 207 names. The reading took a long time. Thorn had the face of a man who had organized the world into categories for so long that having to encounter the specific individual weight of what those categories contained was a form of disorientation he had not previously experienced. He had not thought of Coldvale as 207 people. He had thought of it as an incident with a strategic function. The names made it something his categories were not equipped to absorb. This was not, Seraphine thought, the same as remorse. She was close enough to read the air around him. The texture was not the hollow flatness of Rethus's emptied architecture. It was more active than that. The working of a mind that is encountering data that disrupts its organizing frameworks and does not yet know what to do with the disruption. Whether that disruption became anything was not a question she could answer. It was not hers to answer. Her function was perception, not transformation. You could not truth sight a person into a different person. You could only read what was actually there, and what was actually there in Malrek Thorn, under the names of 207 people, was something she did not have a clean word for. Not remorse and not indifference. something in between that had not yet found its direction. The proceedings were long and thorough, and the outcome was the outcome that the evidence required, which Vaeric presented to the assembled border lords and council members, not as his decision, but as the documented record's conclusion. Because one of the things she had watched him understand in 6 weeks was the difference between power that requires the holder's prominence to function and power that functions because the system holding it is legitimate. He was building the latter, slowly, from the material the former had damaged. She had watched this work happen. She had been in many of the rooms where it happened, and she had said the things she perceived when she perceived them, and he had listened in the way she had first registered in the garrison yard. Not the performance of listening, but the actual receipt of information, the incorporation of it into what he was building. It was not perfect. None of it was perfect. There were council members whose loyalty she had registered as conditional and told him so, and he had to work with them anyway because removing everyone whose loyalty was conditional would remove half the council, and the functioning of governance required working with people who were not perfectly aligned with your interests. There were border lords who were testing the new architecture to find its load-bearing walls, which was their function and also a form of intelligence gathering that he needed to account for. There were decisions made in the War Council aftermath that she thought were wrong and said so, and that he made anyway because her perception of what was true was not the same as his assessment of what was possible, and both of those things were real. This is the thing that the stories get wrong about truth and power in proximity. They make it sound like access to truth simplifies decision-making. It does not. It clarifies it, which is different. Clarity sometimes makes the decision harder, not easier, because you can no longer pretend the difficulty is caused by insufficient information. You know exactly what you are choosing between. You choose anyway. The weight of the choice stays exactly the same. Vaeric had understood this before she arrived. What she had given him was not ease. What she had given him was the ability to stop spending energy on the question of whether what he was seeing was real. What he had given her was harder to name. She had spent 6 years in a limestone building on Salt Marsh Lane, managing the specific loneliness of a person who perceives things others do not perceive, which produces a kind of isolation that is not about absence of company, but about absence of comprehension. You can be surrounded by people and be isolated by the particular shape of what you carry. She had not expected, arriving in Ravengard under ancient law with her kit and her 2 bags, to find someone who could comprehend the shape of it. Not because he shared the capacity, he did not, but because he understood structurally what it meant to carry something that others do not carry and cannot share, to be defined by it and not entirely choose it and have to decide every day what to do with it. He had been carrying that his whole life, just in a different register. But in the weeks after the trial, Ravengard began the work that follows crisis, the slower, less dramatic, considerably more difficult labor of building something functional from the materials that the crisis revealed as compromised. The intelligence chain was rebuilt, with Sorvath, recovered, still opinionated about the strapping, fully operational, heading the review process with the particular thoroughness of a man who has personal reasons for not wanting to miss another Rethus. 3 more compromised officials were identified in the review and removed. 8 officials who had been suspected incorrectly were cleared, which Vaeric handled with the acknowledgement that incorrect suspicion under these circumstances did not require apology, but did require on-record correction. Rethus's case was resolved in a way that satisfied neither Seraphine nor Vaeric completely, which she had come to understand as one of the markers of a right decision. The ones that satisfy everyone tend to have resolved the ambiguity by ignoring it, and Rethus's case had genuine ambiguity that could not be ignored. He was removed from the council permanently, stripped of his position and its authorities, and assigned to a kind of supervised administrative function in the provincial governance of a northern territory that was far from the capital and its strategic briefings. Not imprisonment, not freedom from consequence. Something in between that reflected the in-between nature of what he had done. A man who had made terrible decisions for comprehensible reasons, and had in the end, when given the choice between the vial and putting it down, put it down. The border lords who had rallied to Thorn's cause before the truth of his operation was fully visible were handled differently, depending on what Seraphine perceived when Vaeric brought her into the conversations, which happened quietly and practically, without announcement. Some were deceived men who had been persuaded with false information and whose alignment with Thorn had been genuine and was genuinely revoked when the deception became clear. Some were opportunists who had calculated that Thorn might win and had wanted to be on the right side of the calculation. The distinction mattered for what came next, and she told him which was which, and he used the information the way he used everything she told him, carefully, in service of something larger than the immediate decision. She stood beside him the morning he received the border lords in the Great Hall of Ravengard, 6 weeks after the battle, for the formal reaffirmation of the Dominion's compact with its constituent territories. She stood beside him not on the throne's right side, not in any formal position, because the formal position had not yet been named, and she had not yet decided what she wanted that naming to be. He had not pressed her on it. He had given her the time and the space to decide without the pressure of an expectation, which was, she had come to understand, his version of the deepest respect he knew how to offer. He had treated her judgment about her own position the way he treated her judgment about everything else, which was as real and primary and not requiring his modification. She stood where she chose to stand, beside him. The Great Hall was full of people who were paying attention to Vaeric, as great halls full of people always were, because he was the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, and that was where the formal attention was supposed to go. A handful of them were paying attention to her, the ones who had been in the council chamber and understood what had happened there, or the ones whose instinct for reading a room was good enough to register that the woman who was not in a formal position but was present and not peripheral was worth understanding. Lord Vane caught her eye across the hall and inclined his head, the very small gesture of a man acknowledging something precisely. She inclined hers back. After the formal session, in the corridor outside the Great Hall, Vaeric stopped and turned to her and said, "I want to give you a title." "I know," she said. "Not for my benefit," he said, "for the structure, for the clarity of what your position is and what its function is, so that the next council member who looks across a room and wonders who you are does not have to wonder." "And what would the title be?" "True Speaker to the Crown," he said. "It's historical. It predates everything else. It existed before the Empire and before the Council and before every piece of political architecture that has been built around this throne." He looked at her steadily. "It makes you an office, not a person in the King's service. It gives you standing independent of me." She thought about this. "And the other title, that one," he said, "is a different conversation for a different day, when neither of us is still processing the past 6 weeks. "It's still a yes," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was not managed and not performed, and was the thing that had been underneath the management all along, that she had been reading in pieces since the plaza in Ashmere, and was now simply present, unobstructed, in the way that things become once the obstruction has been identified, and the decision made. "I know," he said. They walked back toward the citadel in the mountain afternoon, in the cold, clear air above the clouds, and the wolf banners moved on the towers above them in the wind, and Ravengard held them the way a city holds the people it belongs to, which is the same way water holds its banks, completely, and with the specific quality of something that has found the shape it was meant to contain. This is what survives the thing that seems unsurvivable. Not the architecture you built before it came. Some of that survives too, the pieces that were true, but not all of it. What survives is the knowledge of what the architecture is actually for. You build a system to hold something. The storm reveals what the system was actually holding, and what it was holding is never the thing you thought when you built it. You built walls. You were holding people. You built chains of command. You were holding trust. You built an empire. You were holding something smaller and more important than an empire. Something that has no official name in the ledgers or the compacts, but that is the actual load-bearing element, the one thing that collapses last and costs the most to repair. Vaeric had learned this on a mountain road between an ambush and a rockfall, in the cold space of a 40-minute wound procedure by firelight, in 30 seconds of a woman standing between him and a vial and saying, "Put it down." Seraphine had learned it earlier and differently, in the smaller storms of a limestone building and 6 years of managing what she perceived alone. She had learned that perception without witness is its own kind of isolation, that knowing what is true is not the same as knowing what to do with what is true, that the gift she had been given was not complete in itself. It required someone who could receive it, and receiving it required the specific courage of a person willing to stop being lied to, including by themselves. Power demands sacrifice, she had heard people say all her life. What she understood now, standing in the afternoon light of a mountain city, was that this was incomplete. Power demands sacrifice, yes. Love demands courage, yes. But the thing underneath both of them, the thing that makes the sacrifice mean something and the courage worth spending, is the decision to remain present to the full weight of what you're carrying instead of managing it from a distance. Vaeric had been managing from a distance for 15 years. He had stopped. This was not a transformation. It was an arrival. He had always been the person who was capable of this. The capacity had been present the whole time, buried under the specific survival adaptations of a man who had learned early that vulnerability was dangerous and had built accordingly. The storm had stripped the building down to what was structural. What was structural had always been there. She had not changed him. She had simply been present while he found what was already his. On the highest balcony of Ravengard, in the late afternoon, they stood above the cloud line and below the mountain's peak, and the empire spread south and north and east and west into the distances that maps only partially captured, and the wolf banners moved in the wind that came off the summit, and neither of them said anything for a long time because the long time did not require filling. He looked out at it, the thing he had built and fought for and nearly lost, with the face of someone who has been asked what they would give up for what they love and has recently discovered the answer is everything, and has discovered further that everything is not as terrifying to offer as they had spent most of their life believing. She looked at him. The truth site registered, clean, no gaps, no performance, no managed distance. Just a man, standing in the wind above the clouds, who had stopped pretending to be less than he was and more than he was simultaneously, and had arrived at the specific, difficult freedom of being exactly what he was, to the one person who could not be lied to and had chosen to stay anyway. He turned and looked at her. "You're still reading me," he said. "Always," she said. "What do you see?" She thought about this, in the way she thought about things that required precision, the same attention she gave to a wound or a deception or the particular texture of the air around a person who is in the process of becoming more honest than they were before. "Someone," she said, "who is going to be very difficult to live with and very much worth the difficulty." He looked at her for a moment. Then, for the first time since the plaza in Ashmere, he smiled. Not the controlled near smile she had catalogued, not the managed version. The real one, which arrived in his face with the quality of something that had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. It changed the entire landscape of him. "That's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "Good," she said. "Get used to it." The wind came off the mountain and moved the banners above them and carried the particular cold of altitude that smelled of pine and stone and the clean nothing of high air, and Ravengard held them in the afternoon light, and the empire went on in every direction, and none of it was finished or simple or without cost. It was real. That was enough. That was in the end the only thing that had ever been enough.